Pomej. Sherlock Holmes in Space. Prequel to Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases. Based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production. Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, Decker observed, pacing nervously on the bridge. And I, as first officer who has assumed command, hereby order the necessary time travel. Yes, but do consider, sir, what a man from the 19th or early 20th century would need to catch up on just to find his bearings here with us, Tornot pointed out. Detailed observations and sober deductions were his speciality. If he truly is as clever as described in the annals of history, he will firstly grasp things very quickly and secondly focus on his real strength, razor-sharp deductive reasoning. Besides, we've become somewhat set in our ways, so it might do us good to have an uninvolved outsider solve our problem. Don't you think he'll view this decision as an indictment of our time, calling upon him to solve some peculiar deaths aboard? Tornot persisted, finding this mission completely over the top, even though he was generally quite open to extraordinary measures. Wistfully, he gazed through the front window on the spacecraft's bridge, from where he could only make out the familiar darkness of the surrounding space. Infinite vastness and hostile conditions out there and inside, partly claustrophobic confines and a perpetrator unbound by morality. We have absolutely no experience in investigative work and need a clever specialist, Decker defended his decision. Yes, but someone from the distant past will surely react with bewilderment to the situation of all-pervasive technology here on board. As far as I know, he's occasionally a morphine user, so we can sell this mission to him either as a dream or delirium, or as a test of whether people from his time can cope intellectually in the future as well. Decker strode purposefully to his control panel, from which he commanded the spaceship. More than that, which made him master over time and space. Or we could simply try the truth, to which he was supposedly always committed. Tornot had realized that Decker, who was taller than him, would not be dissuaded from his plan, especially since he needed to assert his recently acquired leadership position. Already, he initiated the decisive sequence on the retro accelerator. The speed of the Ultimo 1 multiplied, until all humans aboard experienced a slight feeling of dizziness, which soon dissipated. The sound of a very, very unpleasant screeching noise inside the ship swelled, as if someone were scraping a many-pronged fork across glass. It thundered in their ears until they arrived in the year 1900. Travelling back 200 years took less than 2 minutes. Now they were at their destination, the completely pristine Earth, where things like artificial satellites or space debris were still entirely unknown. The people of that time were also unfamiliar with concepts like overpopulation and climate change. People back then will be astonished if they happen to spot our proud ship whilst gazing at the sky. Hardly, since there's marsh gas in the moor that can ignite and create will-o'-the-wisps. That was common knowledge even back then, especially around Dartmoor, of course. And the shuttle has excellent holographic camouflage. You should now dress appropriately for the period, Tornot. You'll surely find something suitable for your size in our collection. I'd best choose a long black coat, as black is always in fashion. And besides, it will also conceal my conspicuous silver-grey uniform. It was New Year's Eve at the turn of the century when the Ultimo 1 glided majestically into Earth orbit. Behind it lay the moon, which at that time had not yet had to endure a visit from any Earth dwellers. Through the large front window, Decker and Tornot observed the European continent, still untouched by the Great Wars. Several colourful fireworks, which had been known to the ancient Chinese, lit up the night sky, that is, the Earth's atmosphere below them. Everywhere, people were looking forward to an approaching, new and hopefully even better century. This forced merriment at every New Year is completely incomprehensible to me, Torno admitted. I enjoy celebrating achievements, such as the conquest of a new planet or the invention of a new device, but the arbitrary end of a human calendar. A brief moment of silence passed. Decker shook his head. It's difficult for us to understand the feelings and thoughts of our ancestors, especially when we're so preoccupied with the challenging present and the future. I wish we could take a break and mingle privately amongst the unsuspecting people. Well, I shall now board the smallest shuttle and collect our unsuspecting Mr. Holmes from his time period. I'm rather curious about his reaction. It will show us whether he's up to the high demands of our technology-obsessed age. Meanwhile, Decker thought to himself, and whether I'm wrong about him or not. A short while later, the Ultimo 1 ejected its smallest shuttle, and Decker received a visit on the bridge from the distinguished Dafflon, the scientific director aboard. In his white coat, he almost resembled a doctor from times past, but on his lapel was a golden medal bearing an image of the spaceship within a cube. "I do hope you know what you're doing, Decker," he uttered softly, as if wanting to give his words more impact. It would be disastrous if any unexpected event were to alter the course of history. "I am quite aware of that, Dafflon, yet I consider the leap into the past a lesser evil than recording our helplessness regarding the dreadful incidents aboard in the logbook. Once this Detective Holmes takes over the investigation, new light will be shed on this entire uncanny business." "As you wish," said the scientific director, and left the bridge again. In his flying disc, disguised with a carriage hologram, Tornot hovered gently just above the lightly snow-covered street. To any outside observer, it appeared as if a pair of white horses were trotting past, pulling a black carriage, without a visible coachman, though leaving no tracks in the snow. One could hardly call it a perfect illusion, as upon closer inspection, the horses' hooves didn't touch the ground. However, the sound of the animals' hooves was deceptively realistic, produced by a sound module. At first, Tornot had made a mistake on the small touchpad on the dashboard and selected the sound of a loudly rattling motorcycle from the 21st century, which fortunately none of the few people on the street had noticed, except for an attentive rag-and-bone woman who quickly made the sign of the cross. Due to atmospheric disturbances, the hologram occasionally suffered minimal distortions, giving the horse and carriage an ethereal appearance. The electronic system had uploaded the map of London from that time period, namely 1900, and was now executing all necessary flight manoeuvres and near-ground driving operations fully automatically without any further input from Tornot. Suddenly, a carriage drawn by two black horses appeared, its jolly coachman chatting away with his friend seated beside him. Since the horses knew the route by heart, he needn't keep his eyes on the road. The street appeared too narrow for both vehicles to pass side by side, offering no room for evasive manoeuvres. The horses of the real carriage whinnied anxiously, and the coachman, upon turning his face forward, spotted the strange carriage rushing towards him, just as it suddenly rose with its white horses and seemed to gallop over him, though of course it actually flew over him and his team. With eyes wide open, he stared upwards, naturally unsure whether to trust them, whether they were showing him an illusion, or if dark forces were at work. "Ah!" the coachman screamed in horror. "That was the devil! Oh God, protect us! The devil has come to London, Derek!" "You stop it, Rodney!" his friend rudely shouted at him, having noticed nothing of the incredible incident, and patted him reassuringly on the shoulder. "You're just completely sloshed again. I swear by all that's holy, I won't touch another drop, Derek. Oh no, that Scottish whiskey is pure devil's brew." Tornot sat comfortably in his compact flying disc as he approached his destination. Though occasional millisecond-long total failures of the hologram occurred now and then, these could easily be dismissed as visual errors, particularly by slightly tipsy observers, or as delirium tremens by hardcore drinkers. Finally, Tornot reached the famous Baker Street, where he stopped the cloaked flying disc, switched off the clip-clop of hooves, and disembarked unnoticed to walk the final few yards. The 1st of January wasn't particularly cold, and a pleasant breeze ran through Tornot's dark hair. It was a sensation he savoured, as service aboard rarely allowed shore leave, let alone without a spacesuit. On the horizon, no skyscrapers yet marred the distant view, and London still maintained its village-like character. Lights still burned in some houses, but there were few people at the windows to closely observe the peculiar stranger. The residents were still busy thoroughly enjoying themselves and exchanging New Year's greetings, which simultaneously heralded the new century. From an open window, the usual drinking songs rang out in loud bellows alongside shrill female laughter. Just as Tornot looked in that direction, a woman with a towering hairdo waved to him. Her ample décolletage, adorned with a valuable necklace, appeared as inviting as her obvious joie de vivre. "You-hoo!" she called out to him cheerfully and laughed. "Do come in, handsome stranger. Join lovely Terry for a glass of sherry." Embarrassed, Tornot waved back and regretted not having more time to join the celebrations, to escape all the problems of over-technologization, and to savour a bit of the simple life with people who knew nothing of atomic fusion, quantum entanglement, or interplanetary navigation. How lovely it would be to simply engage in small talk about trivialities and to be completely unaware of various threats. In his long black coat and his modern yet perfectly matching boots, Tornot didn't stand out at all. There weren't any pedestrians about on Baker Street. Most people were presumably celebrating at home or in a pub until the early hours. The church clock struck a dull 1 o'clock after midnight. Just before number 221B, he actually encountered the flesh and blood Sherlock Holmes, unmistakable in the gaslight, who was just walking home, completely unaware of what was about to unfold, and preparing to enter his house with measured steps. Tornot cleared his throat as he hurriedly stepped to the side of the startled detective. "Mr. Holmes, what an honour to meet you right away. May I ask you to come with me? A rather big surprise awaits you." Tornot put on a very friendly expression, his Sunday face, so to speak, even though Sunday had long since lost its special status among the days of the week, which might have been due to the turning away from religions. "I'm afraid, my dear stranger, but at such a late hour I no longer accept any surprises. Please try again tomorrow from 9 o'clock. "I must insist." Tornot remained friendly, yet firm in his intention, and linked arms with Holmes. "My carriage is just ahead," he whistled briefly, whereupon the ingeniously disguised flying disc, in the form of a horse-drawn carriage, obediently but unnaturally hissed forward with a single jerk. "And a very distinguished person is eagerly awaiting you. Come quickly, prepare to be amazed, and experience your next exciting and most extraordinary case." Holmes was speechless at such impudence, and when he heard of the high-ranking personality, he naturally thought of a member of the royal family. Therefore, he more or less allowed himself to be quickly escorted, or rather dragged, to the aforementioned carriage by this complete stranger. "Get in, and don't be surprised by the interior. It's the latest fashion." Tornot prepared him for the inside of the flying disc, which offered nothing more than 2 seats, the dashboard, and a panoramic view. "Off we go!" "Astonishing," remarked Holmes, perplexed. "I do believe we're flying." "Have you been drinking, Mr. Holmes?" Tornot asked cheekily. "Just 1 glass of champagne. I was invited to a dear friend's and—" He suddenly faltered as he realised they were indeed flying, simply rising into the night sky. The flying disc, disguised as a carriage, ascended to dizzying heights, while the hologram faded and the clip-clop of hooves died away, before finally gliding back into the cargo bay of the mothership, which immediately shifted into a more distant orbit around Earth to avoid drawing any further attention from the planet's inhabitants. Holmes ran one hand over his eyes while pushing his deerstalker hat back slightly with the other. Naturally, he believed he was dreaming and exhaled audibly. Tornot smelt the alcohol on his breath and thought, he must have had a second glass for sure. Hopefully, he'll still be of any use to us. He quickly got out. Holmes asked uncertainly, "Am I awake or am I dreaming?" "Come along, my friend." Tornot hastily beckoned him out and threw his long black coat into the shuttle's interior. "I can assure you, you are wide awake. This way up to our bridge." He promptly ushered Holmes, who was still rubbing his eyes, into the express lift to take him directly to the bridge in no time at all. As he carefully nudged Holmes out of the E-lift, its door closed behind them, and they found themselves facing Decker, whose gold-gleaming uniform commanded respect. Holmes opened his eyes to look around in amazement before gazing into the friendly countenance of Decker, a man of equal height, that is, 6 feet, to himself. Judging by his blonde head of hair, Holmes took him to be Scandinavian and considered him a descendant of the Vikings. "Welcome aboard the Ultimo One, Mr. Holmes. As the most famous English detective of your time, you now have the incomparable honour of solving several mysterious murder cases here," Decker announced with a serious expression, just as he had landed on the bridge and could take a closer look at its sparse yet functional interior architecture. "Would you be so kind as to inform me of my exact whereabouts and why you are all dressed in such peculiar attire?" asked Holmes in his characteristically refined manner of speech. He felt somewhat out of place in his deerstalker hat and period-appropriate brown checked overcoat, beneath which he wore a brown suit, white shirt, and broad, dark green tie. As he spoke, he touched his green tie, which was woven from the finest brocade fabric, befitting the formal occasion. "This might come as a shock to you, Mr. Holmes, but you are aboard a spacecraft currently orbiting Earth in space, and we are the crew wearing our service uniforms," the first officer explained in a weighty tone. "My name is Decker, first officer, and you've already met my deputy, second officer Tornot." "Well, not for very long," Holmes objected, eyeing him suspiciously from the corner of his eye. "Mr. Holmes, we are both great admirers of your previous achievements in the field of criminal investigation," Tornot fawned, trying to butter him up to encourage his cooperation. Holmes approached the enormous front window and gazed at the beautiful blue sphere in the black void of space that now came into view. "This is absolutely incredible. Overwhelming. I cannot find the right words to describe my astonishment. A vessel made of steel and glass that can travel far beyond the 7 seas. It's made of flexible metal and transparent steel," explained Tornot. "Our intelligence service must have missed some important developments," Holmes mused, alluding to the espionage that was already common in those days. "I knew nothing of this. From which country does this breathtaking invention come, if I may ask? And from which country do you gentlemen hail?" He turned curiously back to Tornot and First Officer Decker. "We come from the future, from the year 2100 to be precise. Time travel is possible, though only permitted in special cases," Decker replied to him. "Unfortunately, several mysterious murders have occurred aboard one after another, which we now intend to solve with your assistance." "Child's play for you, my dear fellow," remarked Tornot in his cheeky manner. "I see," said Holmes deliberately, showing no sign of agitation, which was probably due to his typical English reserve. "So one can travel through time without hindrance. Would it not have been more sensible to simply travel to the moment just before the first murder?" "Very quick deduction, but we face certain technical limitations when it comes to time travel. One cannot travel to the recent past, as such destinations are unreachable," Decker explained. "It would be rather like firing a cannon at a small bird just in front of the muzzle. You would overshoot the target." In that case, I suggest we travel back to the beginning of creation to confront God about certain flaws in the supposed crown of his creation." "That is equally impossible, Mr. Holmes. Firstly, because this destination is once again too far away. Secondly, we don't know with certainty whether God exists. We no longer believe in him. And thirdly, if he did exist after all, he would be most displeased if we were to point this out and brazenly criticise his work." "You're quite right," Holmes agreed, looking at Decker with a mixture of appreciation and British coolness. "It would indeed be ill-advised to explain to a god that he would one day be overwhelmed by his creations. Mr. Holmes, I understand that such insights about space and time must be confusing for you. Therefore, I'm giving you the opportunity to decline our offer and leave the ship immediately. Tornot will take you back, and no one will ever know about your little excursion. You yourself will simply forget it and remember it at most as a vivid dream or fever-induced fantasy, or as a drunken stupor Tornot cheekily added. Makes a change from pink elephants. Tornot, stop that, Decker warned him. Very well, gentlemen, I shall take the case. Bravo! That's what I call manly decisiveness, praised the second officer. I express my admiration. Thank you. For now, just tell me what's absolutely essential for my work. Everything else would only distract me from what's important. I'm glad to hear that. After completing your task, for which we will naturally compensate you most handsomely, you can return to your old life without much delay, promised Decker, giving him a conspiratorial wink. At least there's one positive thing about my work here, Holmes acknowledged with a smile on his thin lips. My arch-enemy, Professor Moriarty, isn't here. Certainly not. We mainly have very friendly, pleasant human specimens on board, Tornot reassured him. At that moment, the bridge door silently opened and an attractive blonde woman entered, wearing a blue uniform jacket and a yellow miniskirt. She also wore black over-the-knee boots with high block heels. Without a word, she handed Decker a metal strip, which he swiftly tucked away in his uniform jacket pocket, and departed with graceful steps that had something feline about them, whereupon the door closed behind her. Only the enchanting perfume of the blonde beauty lingered in the air for a while, like a cloud in a clear sky. Although Holmes was puzzled by the doors that opened and closed as if by magic, he didn't let it show. I see that your crew, or the human material, as you prefer to call it, includes women. It's most unusual on ships to employ the fairer sex in uniform. Holmes briefly scratched his temple with his right index finger. Of course we have women on board. We're not as misogynistic as your contemporaries, Tornot blurted out. Holmes shot him a devastating look, much like Napoleon must have given his enemies at the Battle of Austerlitz. You dare to make such an accusation against the proud subject of a queen? Well, not all members of the fairer sex had it quite as good as your revered lady with the crown upon her head back then, did they? Tornot said acidly. Tornot, enough. What do you need to feel comfortable here with us, Mr. Holmes? Inquired Decker with a forced smile. In such cases, my faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, usually prepares me a tea and brings me my favourite type of tobacco for my pipe. Tea will be served right away by our faithful robot Elmer, a non-human metallic servant, but you'll have to do without tobacco, as smoking was long ago deemed extremely hazardous to health by humans and thus banished from their habits. How unfortunate, Mr. Decker, that murder has not likewise been banished from human habits, Holmes observed in a sad voice, not entirely free of irony. Well, said Decker somewhat helplessly, people absolutely refused to be genetically enhanced, which would have meant bidding farewell to their rebellious reptilian brain, which is why we're still inherently bound to those dark, primitive urges. Unfortunately, there's nothing to be done about it. And ethics still don't seem to be highly valued, Holmes muttered to himself while shaking his head meaningfully. The robot Elmer, an impressive, nearly 2-metre tall, radiantly gleaming figure made of steel and flexible plastic parts that gave his head a human-like appearance, emerged from an opening wall panel carrying a silver tray with a lovely cup of still steaming tea. In his other hand, he held a self-unfolding folding chair, which he practically slid under Holmes's bottom, whereupon Holmes automatically sat down and casually crossed his legs. For the first time since his arrival in this world so foreign to him, he appeared completely relaxed. "Here you are, dear Mr. Holmes," offered the friendly robot, presenting him with the cup. "What a lovely cup this is. Meissen porcelain?" Holmes asked with genuine interest as he took the cup and examined it appreciatively. "Not quite. It's mass-produced from our 3D printer. Unbreakable porcelain imitation." "And how wonderfully this tea smells," Holmes delighted, sniffing at the hot beverage which lavishly exuded its aroma. "It's a special blend from the province of—" "Mr. Holmes didn't ask you about that, Elmer," he scolded him. Decker quickly cut him off, fearing that the robot would soon reveal that it was a blend of Martian algae, harvested in a province on Mars, and shipped as a luxury commodity by space freighter to all colonized parts of the galaxy. which would have surely spoilt the English detective's appetite for it. "No, do let this mechanical servant speak. I find what he has to tell me about this surely most delightful tea quite fascinating indeed," Holmes insisted, listening attentively. The robot had understood the first officer's hint and said diplomatically, "A blend of black teas, formerly known as Chinese varieties, once called Earl Grey. The drinking temperature is precisely 62.5 degrees Celsius. The sugar content is exactly 1.8%. The tannin content is extremely gentle on the stomach and agreeable to the digestive system." Impressed, Holmes took a sip and nodded with satisfaction. Excellent, my dear mechanical friend. Very aromatic and not too sweet." He eagerly drained the cup and handed it back to the robot. "Thank you very much." "It is not customary to thank robots for their services, sir," replied Elmer with a courteous smile. "But I gladly accept your thanks as a welcome, rare acknowledgement. Is there anything else you require, sir?" "Not at the moment. I shall let you know as soon as any arise." With that, he slowly rose, whereupon Elmer took back the folding chair. "A comfortable seat that can certainly compete with my favourite chair, despite its rather austere appearance," Holmes noted appreciatively. "And despite initially giving me the impression of being rather wobbly." "As is so often the case, appearances can be deceptive," said Tornot. "You would be quite surprised if you had seen everything on this ship properly." As he said this, he thought about the countless gadgets that could develop a life of their own and thus greatly disturb an inexperienced visitor like Holmes. At that, the robot hurried away with the tray, and Holmes watched him with interest until he disappeared behind his wall panel. Such an obliging mechanical servant who works with such precision and can even provide information independently is quite practical indeed. "We consider ourselves very fortunate to have several of these models at our disposal," Decker admitted. "How lovely for you. While we're on the subject, I should let you know how much I miss my faithful friend, dear Dr. Watson. If only he knew that Dr. Watson would one day become software for detecting computer errors," Tornot thought with amusement, though he kept that to himself, as the good Sherlock Holmes wouldn't have known what to make of the term Integrated Error Diagnostic Program. "But it's no use," Holmes continued. "I suppose I shall have to reach a conclusion on my own." "We implore you to do so, dear Mr. Holmes." Decker encouraged him to put his little grey cells to work. "So exactly how many murders are we dealing with?" Holmes now announced his full readiness to begin work. "About 5 crimes against humanity," Decker reluctantly admitted. "Unfortunately, among the victims is also our brave Captain Beauregard. He was such a gentle, fair superior, the kind one could only wish for. Even a good character and high rank do not protect a man from being murdered by one or several villains." "I rather think we're only dealing with one perpetrator," Decker qualified. "Yes, I agree with that," Tornot immediately concurred with his superior, hoping to score some brownie points. "As you wish. Nevertheless, let's take a walk around the ship and you'll be kind enough to show me where the first murder took place." "Gladly, follow me, Mr. Holmes," Decker urged him and strode briskly ahead, whilst Tornot followed behind Holmes. As soon as they had left the bridge and found themselves in a long corridor, Holmes stopped and, pointing to a strange object on the wall, asked his first purposeful question. "What's inside this peculiar cabinet? Clothing, various useful implements, provisions, or perhaps another robot that serves tea?" "That's an escape pod," Decker explained, "for quickly abandoning ship in case of emergency." "Interesting. And can one travel through time with it, Mr. Decker?" "No. Time travel is only possible with a spacecraft of the size and enormous capacity of the Ulitmo-1. Tornot, who was standing by at a respectful distance, reassured him. "My deputy is correct. There is no possibility for our murderer to escape into another time. The Ultimo-1 consists of the bridge, from which we just departed, has a total of 5 decks, across which 65 remaining crew members are distributed. Some are not permitted to leave their deck. That makes my task easier, provided these people haven't found any hiding places to carry out their evil deeds unnoticed. So you're not ruling out that we might have more than one killer on board? In principle, I don't rule out any possibility, my dear Decker. What's that smell in here, by the way? His refined nose detected an antiseptic scent, one that rarely made its way into his olfactory opening. Like chlorine, a slightly lemony scent, artificially created to put the entire crew in a pleasant mood, said Tornot. Smells play a major role in people's lives. We can safely forget about the possibility that this scent inspired our murderer to commit these acts. But I had almost forgotten to insist on an answer to my question about your origin. Which country do you come from, gentlemen? There are no countries anymore. Humanity has united into a single population of the entire globe, Decker informed him. Yep, we are representatives of a single Earth population, and very proud of it. Tornot unnecessarily pointed out this innovation once again. Nationalities were humanity's childhood diseases. Ah, so I suppose there's only one king or queen now then, Holmes deduced. Both, said Decker quietly, as he didn't want to reveal the whole truth. I'm glad to hear that, as our highly esteemed Queen Victoria had to live alone for many decades after the death of her prince consort Albert. She'll soon be free of that, Tornot blurted out. Tornot, really? Decker admonished him. We are not authorised to predict the gloomy future to Mr. Holmes. Oh, do not worry, gentlemen, Holmes reassured him with a small, placating gesture. Like many of my contemporaries, I am prepared for her imminent passing, for she is truly at a very blessed age. And at 80 years old, her fragile health will likely not sustain her much longer. I give her at most a year and a few days. You have no idea how right you are, Mr. Holmes, Tornot agreed. On 22nd January 1901, she will leave her throne and have to relinquish her sceptre. Yes, sometimes I truly hate being right, Holmes pondered in a brief moment of self-reflection, and foreseeing all the dreadful events unfolding, though on the other hand, this gift helps me anticipate the murderer's actions. But enough of these contemplations. Please convey my most humble regards to their majesties. We'd be happy to do so, Tornot promised him, relieved that he didn't have to confess the whole truth. They will be delighted to receive greetings from the past. We can now enter this steel tube called a lift, which will take us straight down to the engine room where the first murder took place, explained Decker, as a narrow door opened automatically in front of him. After him, Holmes entered, looking around sceptically, but did not let that stop him from asking more questions that seemed conducive to solving the cases. Were all the murder victims male? Yes. Does that lead you to conclude their gender had something to do with their deaths? Tornot inquired curiously. No, I just find it important to get hold of all the facts. By the way, Mr. Decker, what did that pretty blonde lady slip to you earlier? Her name is Laura, and she works in accounting. What you saw was a so-called authorization slip. It's always required for time travels to properly account for the energy consumed. Everything must be in perfect order aboard our vessel. Most enlightening, remarked Holmes. So even in the future, they'll keep meticulous records. He added at the end of his sentence, as if he found such practices rather unnecessary in times to come. The lift door opened and cleared the way to the lowest deck where the aforementioned engine room was located. All three stepped out, and Holmes observed the interior of the spaceship with approval. What fine materials these must be, he remarked, briefly glancing up at the ceiling which appeared to be made of freshly cast metal. Is that precious metal? No, the entire ship is made of 95% steel, which also has shape memory properties, meaning that if it's forcibly deformed by external physical impact, it can immediately return to its original form. Decker had rattled this off almost like a poem. Almost like magic, remarked Holmes, shaking his head. I'm already incredibly proud of all the things my descendants will invent. Now, the door to the engine room opened, and Holmes was apparently searching for something. Where are the engines, then? He wanted to know, as he couldn't spot anything that would have qualified as machinery in his time. Evidently, he had expected enormous steam boilers or something of the sort. "In here," said Decker, pointing to a centrally placed column bearing a sign with the nuclear power symbol. "It's just a small thing, but it has the capability to propel our ship for 1,000,000 Earth years without needing to refuel." "Yes, indeed," confirmed Tornot with a nod. "Remarkable. Even in my time, people used to say, 'Small cause, big effect.'" And here lay the body of our colleague, the ship's engineer, Pomej. "I have a photograph of him for you, Mr. Holmes." Tornot then showed him a photo of the deceased, to avoid startling him with a hologram. "It's even in colour, although colour photography won't be commercially used until 1930. "I beg your pardon, my dear friend," Holmes interjected almost indignantly as he took it. "I am well aware that the Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell showed the first colour photograph during a lecture at the Royal Institution back in 1861. How well educated you are, Mr. Holmes." Decker praised him, whilst thinking with relief that Holmes fortunately could not yet know about surveillance cameras, which had the advantage that he would not ask to see the evidence tapes that the perpetrator had prudently erased. What use was the most advanced technology when there were such utterly evil, crafty people who could easily disable it at the crucial moment, he thought secretly to himself. And dactyloscopy, upon which the biometric process of dactyloscopic identity verification, colloquially known as fingerprinting, based on the biological irregularity of human papillary ridges on the palms and soles, was already well known to us back then. Holmes continued to lecture them tirelessly. As early as 1858, Sir William James Herschel, a British colonial officer in Bengal, came up with the idea of distinguishing individuals by their fingerprints. From 1860, he used this to register payment recipients to prevent identity fraud. This allowed him to effectively prevent pension fraud through multiple payments in the British colonial army. So don't make the mistake of thinking people of my era were so backward as to be unfamiliar with things like colour photography. "I apologise, Mr. Holmes. I forgot that certain inventions are much older than one might give them credit for," Tornot admitted meekly. "And that some were even made by my fellow countrymen," he proudly corrected him, raising his index finger. "Yes, indeed, the great empire and its achievements. Simply unforgettable," nodded Tornot. "How unfortunate that this photograph wasn't taken at the exact moment of his death, so that one could clearly identify the person responsible," said Holmes. "But I'm certain that such an innovation is already being developed." "Unfortunately, it's the case that—" Tornot was about to mention the erased tapes when Decker cut him off. "A brilliant idea, Mr. Holmes," he praised. "However, you would then be denied the incomparable pleasure of investigating with us and getting this unexpected glimpse into humanity's future. What did the poor man die of?" Holmes returned to the actual reason for his presence, concentrating intensely, which wasn't quite as easy for him in these unfamiliar surroundings as it had been in his previous cases. "Cardiac arrest," Decker said spontaneously. "Yes, cardiac arrest," repeated Tornot. "Usually there's a compelling reason behind such an occurrence. For example, a stab wound from a dagger through a vital part of the body, or a gunshot from a pistol, or the ingestion of poison. I could endlessly list such causes for an unnatural cardiac arrest, for it surely wasn't old age that caused his heart to cease functioning." Holmes examined the photograph of the deceased. "I estimate he was no more than 36, as do you both. To be perfectly honest, we couldn't find a cause of death," Decker had to confess, whilst Tornot secretly rejoiced at having been estimated by Holmes to be significantly younger than his actual age. "Then we must focus entirely on the murderer's motive. What position did this man hold?" Holmes slipped the photograph into his coat pocket. "Phew," said Tornot, who thought it pointless to explain to Holmes how a nuclear fusion reactor works. Put simply, he had to conduct random checks to ensure the ship's propulsion system was running smoothly and without harm to anyone on board. And could this important task have appeared so tempting to a colleague that he murdered him precisely to take over this work in his place, Holmes articulated, whilst observing the facial expressions of his conversation partners. Both looked at each other hesitantly, and Decker replied, "No, we consider that impossible. This work is neither particularly exciting nor especially important, as a robot could carry out the checks, but the duty roster stipulates that this task must be performed by a human. That brings me to my next question, which is it possible that one of these robots took the life of the man named Pomej?" "Impossible!" Decker blurted out, as if shot from a ray gun. "All robots share a common component that makes them inherently and cheerfully subservient to all humans." "Aha! Many ancient rulers would have loved to install that in their subjects," Holmes recognised immediately. "And I assume there's no chance that any careless tampering with these non-human servants could have led them to harm a human and cause cardiac arrest?" "No, absolutely not," Decker declared with absolute certainty. "Such a thing has never happened before. We can safely rule it out. As you say, despite its exceptionally good manners, I found the robot that prepared my tea rather suspicious. But if you say so, I suppose it must be true." "Once you get used to these steel fellows, you'll never want to be without them again," Tornot whispered to him in a slightly conspiratorial tone. "Then I see no reason to linger here in the engine room," remarked Holmes, and they left the scene of the first murder once again. Would there happen to be a small facility that, how shall I put this delicately, would be suitable for the usual human excretory functions? Holmes inquired in his refined manner about the lavatory as they stood outside in the corridor. "Certainly, for those human necessities, the facilities you seek are behind the grey door at the end of the corridor," Decker disclosed. "Good thing you didn't tell him that instead of a royal couple, we're governed by King Computer. That would have preoccupied him too much and revived all those concerns about artificial intelligence once raised by skeptics." "He doesn't rule over us," the first officer corrected him sharply. "He merely administers us. After all, we ourselves know what we should and shouldn't do." "Well, evidently at least one of us doesn't know that," Tornot contradicted with a shrug, "because otherwise they wouldn't have behaved so inappropriately, and there wouldn't have been such serious incidents that led to Mr. Holmes's arrival in the first place. I find it hard to believe that it could have been one of us. Yet with all these murders, there's no fear of an undetected malevolent alien being present." Decker wasn't sure whether to be relieved about not having to fight an extraterrestrial creature, or whether to be frustrated about having to investigate his own species. In any case, he was under pressure and desperately wanted to solve these crimes and catch the perpetrator as quickly as possible, preferably yesterday, but due to the technology, that yesterday had become 200 years ago. As if Tornot had read his thoughts, he suddenly remarked, "Actually, these time travels are a great comfort, almost like a holiday from harsh reality. Besides getting a glimpse into an earlier epoch, you gain the not insignificant perspective that those we so painfully miss haven't even been born yet. Yes, there is something comforting about that, but on the other hand, our murderer and all those repugnant despots who enslave humanity and wish to feel godlike will be born again," Decker noted glumly. "Yet we've been forbidden from intervening in humanity's bloody history thus far. Above all, one intervention wouldn't be enough. It would need to be several." Decker nodded knowingly. "One cannot interfere with such a complex process in a simple linear fashion without making it even more complicated." Holmes's return ended their brief philosophical contemplations. "A very luxurious lavatory," he remarked, impressed. "I've stayed in the finest hotels, but I've never come across such a mirrored facility with such a pleasant aroma of fresh tropical fruits." "We know what we owe to our staff, and, above all, to our distinguished guests," remarked Tornot. "Indeed, working here must be a true pleasure." "Well," Decker played it down, "not for everyone." As he said this, he involuntarily thought of his departed colleagues and his beloved boss, Captain Beauregard, who had frequently mentioned that he would rather have command of a ground force. "By the way, How satisfied were you with your working conditions back then, Mr. Holmes? Tornot wanted to know on this occasion. Rather varied. Sometimes I had to venture into seedy taverns or disreputable neighbourhoods against my will for investigations, but I was firmly determined not to concern myself with such. A man emerged from a lift whom Holmes instantly disliked. His bulky frame was squeezed into a tight black uniform with barely visible silver epaulettes. His boots gleamed as if they had been specially polished by an overzealous robot, and he said contemptuously to the first officer, "It seems that your decision to bring in a man from Victorian England wasn't your finest, Decker." Now Holmes felt his honour was at stake, glaring into the portly newcomer's brown eyes as if he could hypnotise him, and took an audible breath, preparing himself for a lengthy dispute. "So far, I have been able to solve even the most intricate cases," he boasted quite rightly. "It is irrelevant that you live in a time where robots brew tea, when people are still the same as they were then, who couldn't care less about manners and extinguish one human life after another. You can count on me and my abilities, even if I was sent into this world much earlier than you. Don't you think you're completely out of place here and are now merely trying to prove the opposite?" The unpleasant fellow now addressed Holmes. "I hate leading questions," he replied spontaneously. "And no, I don't think I'm out of place here, especially since I've already identified you as a potential suspect. You dare to accuse me of multiple murders just because I doubt your abilities? In that ridiculous outfit of yours?" The fat man goaded indignantly. "No, I'm not accusing you of any murders, merely of being capable of having committed some," Holmes parried. "And as for my attire, at least my tailor didn't have to waste as much fabric as yours did, my dear sir." "Your quibbles won't help you here," the man predicted grimly, and disappeared back in the direction from which he had come. "Who was that rude fellow, Mr. Decker? His appearance reminds me of a late portrait of our King Henry VIII, when he had already grown rather fat and corpulent. It must have been a case of spontaneous antipathy, and he refused to pretend that the man was entirely indifferent to him. That, Mr. Holmes, was our ship's doctor, Dr. Zarek, even though he doesn't look particularly healthy himself," he explained, amused. "We just call him Dr. Z for short," Tornot added. "And there was no need to mention the waste of fabric, as we don't need to be frugal with it." "Oh, I do think so, for otherwise the lady from before would have had more of it on her lower extremities," Holmes objected. "It did not escape my notice, although I pretended to deliberately overlook it." "That's the fashion at the moment," Decker explained to him. "If we were to skimp on fabric for our female staff, we'd immediately be in trouble with the equality officer." "Oh, I see. So it's fashionable to leave women's legs uncovered." Holmes appeared embarrassed, but immediately returned to the subject of the unfriendly Dr. Z. "This corpulent Dr. Z, does he have an alibi for the times of the murders?" We haven't checked that yet, as he seemed above suspicion to us." As Tornot said this, however, he glanced somewhat doubtfully at Decker, who merely shrugged his shoulders. From his uniform, which fits a bit too tightly around his girth, I deduce that he also has military experience. "Everyone on board has military training, Mr. Holmes. As first officer, I belong to the elite unit, as did Tornot as my deputy. Dr. Z was also our staff physician. He's a very capable and proud man." "That could also be the motive," concluded Holmes, raising his index finger. "Wounded pride, honour that was possibly injured, which has now transformed into revenge." "The doctor's just swaggering about in his uniform," Tornot joked, which earned him a stern look from Decker, who disapproved of such vulgar language. "Do you mean chicken eggs?" Holmes asked, just to be sure. "No, his testicles, he. I must ask you to mind your language and make an effort to employ more refined diction when in my presence, even if your sense of humour refuses to shy away from crudeness," warned Holmes, piqued. "For I am accustomed to conducting investigations in more elevated social circles." "Oh, we'd better return to the bridge," Decker suggested. The journey in the lift until then proceeded in silence. The atmosphere seemed tense at the moment. No one knew what to say until they finally all stood on the bridge. Again, Holmes glanced through the front window, this time to the opposite side from Earth, where only the blackness of space presented itself. Instead of water, blue skies and the horizon, one sees only oppressive darkness here. This too could be a possible motive, gentlemen. Through the monotonous darkness out there, the light-starved soul of the murderer grew darker. Well, our murderer certainly isn't a victim of the physical surroundings. No, Mr. Decker, rather a victim of the resulting spirit of the times, which, as you mentioned earlier, is godless. Holmes's statement contained undisguised criticism. "Oh, Holmes," Decker mumbled, then said more loudly, "Times are changing, and constantly so. We all must move with the times. Certainly there are some constants in history." "Oh yes, there are indeed. Since its invention, the wheel keeps being used over and over." Holmes twisted his mouth into what appeared to be a mocking smile. "And sometimes someone claims they've reinvented it." "Let's take you as an example, my friend," Tornot began. "Even during your lifetime you enjoy fame, and it will only grow after your death. I once read about an amusing incident. Would you like to hear it? It concerns the future after you." "Tornot, no," warned Decker. "Let's stay on topic." "Not at all, Mr. Decker. I think he should go ahead and tell me this anecdote. Who knows? It might even lead to the solution of one case or another that still lies ahead of me, enabling me to solve it more quickly, or perhaps even help solve our current case." "As you wish, Holmes. Go ahead then. Tell us, Tornot," Decker reluctantly prompted him. "After your death, several Sherlock Holmes clubs will be established," Tornot began, "by people who will also pride themselves on their excellent powers of observation. And then it will happen that during a city trip, one of the members will have their handbag stolen. Unfortunately, afterwards, none of the attending members will be able to give the police a useful description of the perpetrator, despite all of them trying to emulate your keen observation and deductive skills. Ha ha ha. This will take place in 100 years. Ha ha ha." Decker shook his head disapprovingly, and Holmes remained equally unamused. "Tornot, one does not mock human shortcomings," Decker rebuked him sharply. "Excuse me, sir. And what do you make of that, Mr. Holmes?" asked Tornot, still slightly spluttering. "Not one of them will be able to provide a useful description of the perpetrator, despite all being registered Sherlock Holmes Club members. Ha. Useless, I find it, my easily amused friend. Your brief account contributes absolutely nothing to our current search for the perpetrator, and I seriously doubt that remembering this will help me with any other cases." "Oh, we were talking earlier about that murdered fellow Pomej, who was the ship's engineer in the engine room. So he was the first to fall victim to a crime. The next one was—" "Captain Beauregard," Decker admitted with a mournful expression. "Here's a photo of him." The second officer handed him the photo of the dead Beauregard. With a scrutinizing look, Holmes examined it and then observed, "Somehow he bears a surprised expression on his pale face. We should reflect on who last had contact with him, possibly the third victim. The captain was often the first point of contact for the crew when there were problems. The enchanting Hylia told me she was the last one to see Beauregard alive," reported Tornot. "Then we should pay a visit to this charming lady." He also tucked the captain's photo into his coat pocket. "Of course, Mr. Holmes, come with us. We'll take you to headquarters where she works." Decker hurried ahead and continued, "That's where all important assignments sent to us are handled." "Interesting. Do you receive these assignments via wireless telegraphy using Morse code?" Something like that, but quite different really. It would be a bit too complex to explain our procedure to you right now," said Tornot, as he was the last to enter the lift that took them to the lower mezzanine deck, where the aforementioned control centre was located at one end. In a very bright small room with 4 currently switched-off monitors on each wall, an elegant black-haired woman sat on a black swivel chair, wearing the same uniform as Tornot, though in bronze. "Hello, what a rare visit," she said in a husky voice. "May I introduce Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Hylia?" Decker pointed at him with his thumb. He would like to know something about your last visit to the captain. Without waiting for the question, she started chattering away. Yes, he summoned me, good old Beauregard. Wanted to know personally whether our government had sent him any orders in the past few hours, to which I correctly informed him that if such orders had been received, I would have conveyed them to him long ago. Then he acted quite puzzled and said he wanted to speak with Magma now. That woman, in my opinion, is keen on a quick promotion. I don't know if he managed to contact her before his passing. She denies it. But perhaps she'll tell you something completely different, Mr. Holmes. It wouldn't surprise me at all, as that woman says one thing one moment and another the next, depending on whatever mood she happens to be in. Said Holmes, who didn't much care for chatty people. Well then, we'll take our leave and head off to see that moody Lady Magma. Following this, all three gentlemen left the control centre, with Hylia calling after them. Do come visit me again soon. It's rather boring here, downright dull. A person who loves to hear themselves talk, Holmes noted indignantly. Moreover, she seems under-challenged. Why don't you give her the task of cleaning the 4 blind mirrors on the walls? Somewhat disconcerted, Decker and his deputy exchanged glances but remained silent. Right then, where do we find this Lady Magma? She works in the sports hall and trains our colleagues in physical exercise. Decker enlightened him. For that, we'll need to go back down to the lower deck, Tornot observed. It seems we're being sent from pillar to post. That's perfectly normal detective work, my dear friend, Holmes confirmed. One mustn't let it get them down, even if the path ultimately leads back to where one started. Shortly afterwards, they arrived at the gym, a large hall with a subtle smell of sweat, where various pieces of exercise equipment lined the walls for the fitness training of the onboard crew. Despite the artificial gravity, muscle deterioration could easily occur during prolonged physical inactivity in front of the monitors. At one of the machines, a young man in a white shirt and black shorts was doing sit-ups, counting tirelessly. 63, 64, 65. They had barely walked a few steps past him when Magma came running towards them, accompanied by a whiff of menthol fragrance. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a long ponytail, and she was wearing an orange full-body leotard. Her complexion showed rosy cheeks, suggesting she was slightly flushed from exertion. I beg your pardon for the interruption, my athletic lady. Holmes began straight away without the usual introduction, as he feared being talked down by this energetic lady as well. He preferred to be the one leading the conversation. We wanted to inquire whether you might have met with the captain shortly before his death after all. No, I don't like to repeat myself, except during my fitness exercises, but it's just as I already reported to First Officer Decker. Beauregard was meant to come to me for a personal training session, but he failed to show up. Would you like to exercise, sir? It keeps you fit and stimulates the brain. No, Holmes quickly declined. I prefer to exercise my dexterity on the violin, and my brain has always worked perfectly well without any sweaty gymnastics. We shan't bother you any longer. As they left, they could still hear the young man counting. 83, 84, 85. Somewhat dejected, all three left the gymnasium and made their way back to the lift that took them to the middle deck. Would you allow me to briefly retire to the small room of relief? Holmes informed the two of his need for a short break. Make yourself at home, Decker encouraged him, extending his arm in the relevant direction. At least 2 of them are freely available on each deck. Holmes hurried to the facility in question, made sure he was alone inside, looked at himself in the large mirror above the futuristic sink, and quickly pulled out his tobacco pipe, long matches and tobacco pouch from his coat pocket. Carefully, he stuffed the pipe, put it in his mouth, lit a match, and held it to the designated opening of his pipe. Puffing away, he inhaled the mild, sweet smoke, which pleasantly tingled on his tongue, and gave him a comforting sense of being at home. Ah! He sighed contentedly, not realizing that his unauthorized breach of the no-smoking rule would soon be severely punished. Still unsuspecting, he took a few smacking puffs and blew out a small cloud. Beep! Above him, a red light flashed several times and began beeping increasingly rapidly. Holmes looked up with interest, naturally having no idea that the smoke detector was frantically chirping away in alarm. How peculiar! Immediately afterwards, the sprinkler system activated and drenched poor Holmes with a proper cold deluge of water, leaving him standing there like a drowned rat. Naively, he blinked his eyes, trying to see clearly through the film of water on his pupils. On his wrist computer, Decker simultaneously received a message from the smoke detector, which also transmitted a 3D image of the culprit. Has a fire broken out on board? Wondered Tornot, who had heard the beeping beforehand. That was just our Holmes, who was smoking in shower room 12. Come along, we'll have to admonish him to refrain from such unacceptable misconduct in future. The two of them marched purposefully to the soaking wet Holmes and gave him a stern telling off. Mr. Holmes, Decker began in a stern voice, so you've disregarded our no-smoking rule. Indeed, and sneaking about in shower cubicle 12 like a naughty little boy, no less, added Tornot, just as sternly, wagging his finger. No need to drown me straight away. Holmes scolded just as sternly with a very grim look. Look at me. I'm standing here as if I'd just survived the sinking of the Drummond Castle on 16th of June 1896 as one of only 3 survivors. The rapid dryer is ready here, Tornot explained, and gently nudged him into a narrow niche of the wet room. Don't be startled. Immediately, a grey cloud enveloped the stock-still Holmes, who, once the cloud had dissipated, meticulously searched himself for any remaining damp spots, but found none. Indeed. Everything about me is bone dry again. Just like your sense of humour, Tornot joked. I must protest most strongly, Holmes objected gruffly. My sense of humour is that of an average Englishman who is capable of mastering even the worst vicissitudes of life with an occasionally sardonic smile. Well, now you've shown us your tremendous eloquence once again, and can return to focusing on your work. Decker was growing rather impatient. As you might imagine, we'd like to conclude these investigations as soon as possible. Steady on, steady on. Good things take time. Now where were we when that unexpected jet of water hit me from above? Ah yes, we were at that moment, Dr. Zarek joined them. Am I interrupting? Since the smoke detector signalled a blaze, I thought I might be of assistance. Is anyone injured? No, Dr. Z. Decker waved him off. Our good Holmes is just thoroughly inspecting the safety measures in our lavatory facilities. Tsk! Tornot barely managed to suppress a gloating laugh. There, they all stood peacefully together, though Holmes cast rather hostile glances at the portly ship's doctor, Dr. Zarek. He couldn't help it. He simply couldn't stand him. Even during their second encounter, there was no reassuring sense of getting used to him. The doctor pretended not to notice, and remained otherwise very detached. Strange, Holmes suddenly noticed, as he pulled out his golden pocket watch and checked the time. I don't feel the slightest bit tired, even though I've been awake for 18 hours. It's the same for us. Tornot crossed his arms whilst glancing sideways at Decker, who nodded in agreement. Though we've been awake far longer than you have, my dear Mr. Holmes. Do the gentlemen not intend to seek their beds for a spot of sleep? Holmes inquired, puzzled. We must confide in you that people of the future no longer need to sleep, Decker revealed to him. Is that so? Yes, because it's wasted time when you consider that in the past, one was forced to spend a third of one's life in bed. Dear Decker, do tell me the secret of your vitality despite constant sleeplessness, for I too sometimes suffer from being unable to fall asleep, and it does me no good whatsoever. I can well believe that, Mr. Holmes. Until now, you haven't had access to Wekatomin, invented in 2095, a remedy that allows the body to function continuously while simultaneously recovering during wakeful rest. Yes, that's right. So when we're standing or sitting, our cells recover and can reproduce effortlessly, whilst we continue to think, speak, or carry out other activities that aren't as strenuous as walking, jumping, and fighting, explained Tornot. Marvellous invention. Was it made by an Englishman? Oh no, as you told me earlier, countries no longer exist, Holmes recalled sadly. Nevertheless, I'm curious where this brilliant mind was born. Well then, if you absolutely must know, it was a woman named Celia McCabbott, and she came from what used to be Ireland. There you have it, gentlemen, from this corner, the Great Britain, come the most brilliant minds, just like myself. With that, he puffed out his chest, like a cockerel strutting past his hens, to use a comparison from his time. You are rather full of yourself, my dear sir. Dr. Zarek could no longer contain himself. Perhaps you'll even come up with the absurd notion that someone committed all these murders specifically to initiate a time travel journey to you. Well, that's an interesting aspect, Dr. Z, which we, now that you've brought it up yourself, should no longer disregard. At that, the doctor left the premises without a word. He swept away with an expression as if he had been stripped of all his merits. The man is as vain as a peacock, remarked Holmes, raising his eyebrows critically. And I was just about to ask him the important question of how this remarkable stay-awake remedy called Wekatomin is administered through what I consider the simplest route, namely the food, my dear Holmes, Tornot informed him, amused. Aha, and will I be getting my share of it too, gentlemen? He looked questioningly from one to the other. But Mr. Holmes, with the logical part of your detective brain, you must have already deduced that you've already sampled it, given your lack of fatigue. Tornot was thoroughly enjoying himself at Holmes's expense. I beg your pardon, Holmes wondered. But I didn't eat anything. Ah, the tea. Mentally enlightened, he swiftly raised his index finger to his temple. So this substance is completely tasteless as well. Marvellous. Congratulations on your eureka moment, my dear fellow. And now let's return to our search for the murderer, Decker suggested. What impressions can you share with me thus far? Since I assume you are only interested in impressions relevant to finding the perpetrator, I can be quite brief. My impression is that the murderer must still be on board, whether they like it or not. Bravo! That's exactly what we assumed as well, my dear Englishman, said Decker in a slightly strained voice, as he felt he was being made fun of, something he absolutely couldn't stand. With quick steps, he left washroom 12 and hurried back to the bridge. When Tornot and Holmes had also returned to the bridge, Decker settled into the captain's retractable command chair and asked the detective, What else do you have to report to me? Well, since there are distasteful substances here on board, I'm drawn to the suspicion that the victims might have been given something through their food that wasn't as beneficial for them as this Wekatomin. A reasonable thought, but we lack any evidence for that, Mr. Holmes, Tornot criticised. Well, now that I have this suspicion, I can investigate in that direction, gentlemen. It will soon become apparent whether it was indeed the correct suspicion. A post-mortem examination would certainly offer no help, as I rightly assume that the lethal substance would have disappeared without a trace in the body after achieving its desired effect and could no longer be detected. These days, we don't need to perform autopsies anymore. We've thoroughly examined the bodies, of course, but found no poison or radiation from radioactive materials that we use for our ship's propulsion, Decker admitted. Though it could well be as you suspect. Especially when you consider that even the Romans knew, quod me nutrit, me destruit, what nourishes me, destroys me. The intestine, with a length of 8 metres and a surface area of 400 square metres, these details I know from my friend Dr. Watson, surely offers enough space to overlook a small trace of poison or any remnants thereof. Holmes touched his distinctive nose, as if regretting that he couldn't serve as a poison sniffer himself. We can assume that nothing has been overlooked, Tornot reassured him, folding his arms. By the way, what about the side effects of this remarkable stay-awake drug, Wekatomin? Holmes persisted with his poisoning theory. Since its invention, not a single negative side effect has been recorded. Decker feared that Holmes would immediately say, There's a first time for everything. However, he was interested in something else. Are there people who refuse Wekatomin? or from whom it is even withheld, Mr. Decker? Yes, that's right, because in our society, criminals and regime critics are sent to sleep. Forever? It rather depends. Whether they committed a minor offence or a capital crime? Holmes probed further. Decker had little inclination to explain everything in detail and merely said, "Naturally, our punishments are proportional to the crime, and there are certainly some who, to preempt your next question, are clever enough not to get caught. In this particular case, that means if we're dealing with a novel poison that decomposes without a trace immediately after its lethal effect, then he would have succeeded." Tornot finished the sentence and let his arms drop in discouragement. "Which can only lead us back to the murderer through the motive," Holmes said irritably. "Unless one of you invents a new method that can detect traceless poisons as well as track down their malicious users." "Hardly possible, since one of the dead is our research officer." Tornot looked at Decker as if this uncomfortable fact had only just occurred to him after Holmes's detailed exposition. "Aha!" Holmes snapped his fingers, making a loud noise that caused Elmer to emerge from his wall panelling. "Did you call for me, Mr. Holmes?" he inquired politely. "No. Yes, Elmer, you could make us some tea." "Right away, sir." Theoretically, it could be that only one person was actually the killer's intended target, and the others simply had to die to obscure who was truly in the murderer's way, as otherwise they could have been easily suspected. This combination occurred to Holmes, while it had not yet crossed Decker and Tornot's minds. "So you mean a simple diversionary tactic?" Decker refused to believe in such vileness. Elmer served tea for everyone, and they enjoyed it like a pleasant drug that could relax the mind and evoke beautiful thoughts. "I already noticed the absence of valuable wall paintings on your beautiful ship." Holmes brought up what was preoccupying him. "Don't you have a painting of your ruling couple? I would so much like to catch a glimpse of what people look like who are permitted to rule the entire world, whether they radiate more dignity and competence than our Queen." Decker and Tornot exchanged meaningful, slightly doubtful glances. It seemed that such a moment of truth had arrived, and they both wondered whether he was ready for this truth. "I'm sorry to have to shock you a bit, Mr. Holmes, but humans are no longer in charge of us. It is a very wise machine called World Computer, an artificial intelligence that provides us with important decisions," Decker confessed to him. "Not possible!" Holmes suddenly turned quite pale in the face. He looked as though he needed time to digest this inexplicable news. "That reminds me of an old joke, Mr. Holmes," Tornot grinned. "When the first computer was created, someone asked the question, 'Does God exist?' And the machine answered, 'Now there does.' Ha, ha, ha!" "Tornot, control yourself," Decker reprimanded him harshly. "One doesn't make stupid jokes about such serious matters." "I apologise, sir. Actually, I didn't find that joke so stupid, Mr. Decker," Holmes objected, though he suppressed a laugh. "The irony of fate, all those centuries, humans prayed to a god who would only be constructed by a much later generation. Well, at least one can still modify some of its settings," Decker revealed to him. "But only selected experts are allowed to do that." "A council of elders?" Holmes inquired with renewed hope. "One could literally call it that. People can now live much longer than what the Bible described. It stated, 'Your life shall last 70 to 80 years.' But the Old Testament states that a certain Methuselah lived to be 969 years old, making him the oldest person mentioned in the Bible," recalled Holmes, who naturally knew the contents of the Book of Books in precise detail. "Correct, but even today's humans don't live quite that long." "That wouldn't be particularly advantageous for their consciousness," Holmes pondered. "If I imagine having to endure the perversities of my contemporaries for 969 years. No, that's far too prolonged a discomfort, and I'll gratefully decline such an immense lifespan." "And how about 250 years, Mr. Holmes?" Tornot couldn't resist asking. 250 years, he repeated, and seemed to be weighing up all the advantages and disadvantages of such a long time in that moment. And all that time being awake too, non-stop, so to speak. Well, I would say that's about as much as I could bear. Oh dear, thought Decker. He's probably going to request life extension as payment for his successful work, which is particularly difficult with people who have already been born. But back to my work, Mr. Tornot. Do you believe that a much older person would no longer consider murdering someone? You mean whether morality increases with age? Tornot sought to confirm whether he had understood the question correctly. No, I doubt that. People stay as they are no matter how old they get, but that's just my insignificant opinion. Besides, none of those ancient people are on board. People retire at 200 in our system, Decker explained to him, calculating that he still had nearly 150 years of work ahead of him, which, given the current difficulties, didn't seem appealing at all, especially under such aggravating circumstances as having 2 lawyers on board who might let criminal elements get away with lenient sentences, possibly even under the guise of diminished responsibility due to mental deterioration from excessive time spent in space travel. Well, we can dismiss that suspicion straight away, as I was just thinking that there are people who become increasingly malicious with age. Yes, that's true. I'm thinking of a great uncle of mine, Tornot began to tell, who had the audacity to— Tornot, Decker interrupted him irritably. Your family matters really don't belong here. Sorry, sir. Yes, indeed, family, Holmes cut in. You mentioned retirement at 200, so when exactly does one start working, Mr. Decker? At 20, although the union has repeatedly protested against child labour and still demands raising the working age to 50. But the union existed in your time too, didn't it, Mr. Holmes? Oh yes, their formal state recognition in Great Britain was granted back in 1872. Holmes lectured somewhat pedantically, relishing the opportunity to show off his knowledge. Well, look at that, Tornot marvelled. Who knows, if they hadn't existed, humanity might have developed technologically even faster, albeit with higher losses. A moment of silence ensued before Holmes spoke again. What was the murdered research officer working on? And what was his name? His name was Forsk, and he was quite a bold chap, replied Tornot. Downright brazen, I'd say. He didn't tell us anything about that, which means he didn't receive any orders from above. Decker was still thinking feverishly, as something stirred in his memory that he had once noticed, but he had simply forgotten it due to his many duties, and now he couldn't recall it. Could your Captain Beauregard have given him such an assignment that was meant to remain secret until initial successes had been achieved, and Mr. Forsk could be released from his confidentiality? Good thinking. That should be easy to verify. Tornot, check Captain Beauregard's private logbook, Decker ordered imperiously, having leapt up from the captain's chair and awakened to frenetic activity. Agitated, he now paced back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back. Why didn't I think of that myself straight away? Torno ran off as if there was imminent danger. Don't be so hard on yourself, Mr. Decker. Holmes consoled him after Tornot had left the bridge in such haste to visit the captain's private quarters. After all, you had to take on the hefty responsibility for this enormous ship and its crew. No one can blame you for not displaying the deductive skills of a professional detective. Everyone grows with their challenges, and I'm certain that one day you'll be able to handle a second profession without complaint. Decker looked at him as if Holmes had just openly told him that he considered him mentally slow, and explained, One reason for this is that we have strict data protection rules, and no one has the right to simply access another person's private records. That may be so, Mr. Decker, but in circumstances such as quintuple murder, surely necessity knows no law. To this he wanted to object, but merely nodded dispassionately. On his way to Captain Beauregard's private quarters, Tornot ran into the doctor while stepping out of the lift, who immediately cornered him. Tell me, Tornot, couldn't you talk our new leader out of bringing in this antiquated Englishman from the past? He nearly caused a fire, and he clearly can't keep up mentally in our progressive high-tech world. This pompous simpleton. He's already addled his brain with tobacco smoke. Smoky would be a fitting name for that old-fashioned fop. Of course I objected, but it was shot down. Decker can be quite stubborn at times, as you well know, Dr. Z. But this Smoky Holmes is rather crafty. He's not half as naive as you think. Meanwhile, Decker showed his guest from the past the amenities on the bridge. Are you familiar with daydreams, Mr. Holmes? We can easily make them take shape. The hologram of a bikini-clad beauty was already dancing to the soft sounds of synthesizer music. With swaying hips, she enticed the bewildered Holmes, who felt as if he were in Madame's establishments. Enough, Mr. Decker. Tell this brazen, scantily clad lady to put some clothes on, or she'll catch her death of cold. Wistfully, Decker made the sexy apparition vanish, and instead conjured up a string quartet, which passionately performed a piece by Debussy. Ah, Holmes said with delight, that's much better. There, I've found it. Rejoice! Exclaimed Tornot as he came running with the private logbook, which looked like an early e-reader, straight through the performing musicians. Tornot, what on earth is wrong with you? Report properly, if you please, scolded Decker, who, after terminating the hologram, sat back down in the command chair with a rather disgruntled expression. I apologise, sir. I respectfully report. In Captain Beauregard's private log on the penultimate page, it clearly states in large letters, Project 5 commissioned. And what else? Decker probed. Nothing else. Project V could also mean Project Roman 5, 5 victims. This means we need to question his closest confidants, colleagues, and his mistress about it, Holmes directed. Let's start with the latter. It was said that he had an affair with Talita from the Internal Research Department. Decker visibly struggled to provide such intimate information about a deceased superior, but he realised it was necessary to delve into the dead man's life to track down whoever had played such a foul game with him. He still felt duty-bound to his superior, even though he now aspired to his position, which he by no means held securely. As the French say, who no longer have their own country, Holmes asked rhetorically. Cherchez la femme. No need to search for long, we know exactly where they all are, Tornot remarked cheekily. Very good. How many of them are there on board? According to the current equality principle, we are obliged to have an equal number of women and men aboard, Decker admitted. However, there appears to be a slight surplus of female crew members, Holmes noticed. Why? Tornot couldn't follow the reasoning. Decker glared at him reproachfully. Because all 5 corpses are male. Therefore, our detective logically concluded that there are now 5 more women aboard. Yes, of course, Tornot mumbled, embarrassed, and resolved not to ask spontaneous questions in future, especially not why questions. We should visit this Lady Talita at her workplace, Holmes suggested, adjusting his hat to ensure he would make a good impression on the lady. I wager she can give us an important clue, or somehow reveal herself to be either the perpetrator or an accomplice. Yes, this betting fever was always typical of you Brits, Tornot grumbled. At Ascot, you could bet not only on horses, but also on the colour of the Queen's hat, whether lemon yellow, sky blue, grass green, or Queen Victoria always dressed in Black Widow's attire after the death of her husband, Holmes informed him indignantly. She would have looked absolutely ridiculous in a little hat of lemon yellow, sky blue, or grass green. Come along, Mr. Holmes, let's head to Talita's workplace. Decker placed his left hand almost imperceptibly on Holmes's back and started walking in step with him. However, I must remind you that here we always presume innocence, so if you suspect the lady, you should do so without letting her notice. I can assure you of my complete discretion, Mr. Decker, which includes that particularly English way of veiling direct accusations within a factual and friendly manner of questioning a lady. We'd better brace ourselves for something, thought Tornot, who was following at a short distance. I am quite curious whether this Lady Talita dresses as seductively as Lady Lura. Sherlock Holmes was becoming increasingly familiar with the circumstances of his novel surroundings and behaved exactly as if he were at home in Victorian England. With self-assured demeanour, he stepped into the lift as if he had done it hundreds of times before. "The ladies on board sometimes interpret the uniform regulations rather loosely," Decker admitted to him. "But during our field missions, they must wear the same attire as us men, which may not be as becoming but is tremendously practical." "I am, as a matter of principle, against putting ladies in men's clothing," Holmes protested. "It's not that bad when you know what they look like underneath," Tournotte joked. "And have you already given all the ladies a thorough inspection?" Holmes probed. "You can bet your arm on that, Smokey," he replied with a grin. Holmes raised his eyebrows disapprovingly, though it wasn't entirely clear what he disapproved of more, Tournotte's way of speaking about the ladies or the nickname he had given him. The Internal Research Department was located on the lower deck directly opposite the cargo room. It was a clinically white laboratory section, where they were greeted by a sharp antiseptic smell upon entering. Holmes looked around with great interest, but couldn't spot anything particularly exciting apart from some test tubes on shelves and a table with pipettes, a microscope, and a metal plate. "A fair amount of uncertainties that crop up during our assignments get cleared up here," Tournotte informed Holmes. "Indeed," he said, whilst thinking that there probably wasn't much research going on at present. At the same time, he wondered whether humanity's thirst for discovery would ever come to a standstill, even after countless centuries had passed. At that moment, she emerged from the background and captured Holmes's gaze. A petite figure of only 5 feet 3 inches, wrapped in a white coat worn open, underneath which was a short white dress that reached only halfway down her very slender thighs. Her small feet were in white boots with thin, medium-height heels that raised her height to 5 feet 5 inches. Her brunette hair was braided upwards, fixed at the crown with a bronze clip in the shape of a small crown, the Rolex trademark. From her delicate face, violet blue eyes gazed out beneath long black eyelashes. While one couldn't call her beautiful, her appearance awakened something of a protective instinct in most men. She wasn't a femme fatale, but rather an erotically appealing ingenue with whom one could easily fall in love. "Talita, this is our guest, Mr. Holmes," Decker introduced him. "He would like to ask you something." "Yes, please." Her voice sounded surprisingly firm, in contrast to her otherwise fragile appearance. "Lady Talita, I have no wish to pry into your relationship with Captain Beauregard, but the current circumstances surrounding his death compel me to do so." He began the conversation, losing himself in her eyes, or rather, gazing into them as if he could see into the very depths of her soul. "I mourn for him. He was my mentor. I owe this position aboard to him." At this disclosure, she looked somewhat bashfully at the ground. "He was the only man who always believed in me, and in my abilities." And did you thank him for that with tenderness?" he asked as sensitively as possible, suspecting that Beauregard might have hoped for a liaison with her in return. Now she looked at him somewhat angrily and said hastily, "No, I did not have an intimate relationship with him, if that's what you mean, Mr. Holmes. Truly not." "Well, that wouldn't be a crime," he remarked, making a dismissive gesture as if shooing away a fly. "No, of course not, and it wouldn't be a reason to kill him," she said quickly. "Well, I could imagine that perhaps in a moment of weakness he pressured you and you rejected him, during which he met his death." "No, he never pressured me into anything. I only kissed him once, on the cheek. One of my colleagues noticed, and subsequently spread these rumours about me supposedly having an affair with the captain, but that wasn't true. And no, I really don't know who could have killed him, just like the others." "I believe you," said Holmes, and was already turning to leave, although he would have liked to question her further, as he felt very comfortable in her presence. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," she called after him, raising her hand as if she were in school wanting to be noticed by the teacher. "Yes? I think you should get in touch with Melwyn. And would you tell me exactly who that is?" "He's one of the 2 lawyers aboard the Ultimo One," she stated. and he's the more unpleasant of the pair. Talita, really now, how can you discredit Ralbo's partner like that? Decker criticised her. But Mr. Decker, Holmes scolded him at once. Lady Talita is surely entitled to express her opinion and suspicions. There you have it, sir, she said tartly to Decker, and turned back to Holmes. You see, I had arranged to meet the captain in the private sector, but Melwyn interrupted us during a perfectly innocent conversation. Oh, really? Yes, she affirmed. Do go on, my dear, Holmes urged her. I'm afraid I can't tell you much, because Melwyn didn't start speaking before I left. Only that he looked very, very angry, downright aggressive, though I don't know why. Most enlightening, thank you very much, Lady Talita. You're welcome. Do come and visit me later, and I'll show you what I'm working on, she suggested with a smile, her violet eyes disappearing behind her black eyelashes. If time permits, I shall take you up on your charming offer, Lady Talita, Holmes promised her, as I always enjoy learning something new. That would delight me, she bid farewell, and gracefully retreated in the direction from which she had appeared. Decker, Tornott and Holmes stepped back into the lift. Gentlemen, this charming little lady is what we call a dame to kill for, Holmes revealed bluntly. Her seemingly helpless manner, those dreamy eyes, the melancholic gaze, that gentle smile, all of this can drive a man to madness, to raging jealousy. If you catch my meaning, I'm envisioning a ménage à trois. Tornott nodded knowingly. To kill out of jealousy is what we call murder with base motives. Decker pushed out his lower lip slightly. I find it hard to imagine that such base motives could have played a decisive role aboard our ship. Never underestimate the power of emotions, Holmes warned him. They're found not only amongst the lower classes, but right up to the royal households. Yes, I must agree with him, said Tornott. Do you remember, sir, when our vice-president ran off with Captain Richmond's wife? So now we've arrived at the upper deck in the so-called private sector, Decker announced, as the lift door opened, without reprimanding Tornott for gossiping about absent persons, especially when it concerned such high-ranking personalities. The private sector presented itself in a colour pleasing to the eye. Grass green with golden yellow seating that invited one to linger. On an oak table stood a silver bowl with fresh-looking fruit, bananas, apples, pears, and both green and blue grapes. An appetising still life. Well, it's high time I had something to eat, Holmes announced his empty stomach, and was about to reach for one of the tempting fruits. I'm afraid, Mr. Holmes, this fruit is made of plastic and is inedible. Decker shrugged his shoulders. Oh, he said, disappointed. Yes, Tornott confirmed. It's purely decorative, a feast for the eyes, so to speak. What a pity! And what sort of edible fare does one serve in the future? Everything that comes from the food dispenser, Decker revealed, leading him to one of the machines standing around that looked like one-armed bandits from ancient casinos. Look, you select a menu from these pictures here, simply press it, and a compact slice of tasty nourishment comes out down here in the dispensing slot. So-called finger food, for which one doesn't need any cutlery, Tornott added, tapping one of the images and removing a slim slice from the aforementioned slot. Sherlock Holmes scratched his chin as he closely examined the pictures of roasted chickens, fish like salmon and halibut, pigs on spits, and roast beef. After circling around with his index finger, he selected a roasted chicken, pressed as instructed, and retrieved a steaming slice that smelled of roast chicken. He took a hearty bite, chewed briefly, and swallowed. Tastes splendid, truly a very delicate menu, he announced, and continued eating. Decker wondered whether he should confess to Holmes, who was heartily munching away, that he had just consumed insect proteins flavoured with artificial meat aromas, but settled for a simple nod of agreement. As far as he knew, insects back then were only referred to as vermin, except for the useful honeybees. And it's very healthy too, Tornott recommended with a full mouth. Careful, my friend, Holmes warned him after politely swallowing. There's a morsel of food dangling from the left corner of your mouth. Oh, pardon. He quickly wiped his mouth. Is it gone? Holmes grunted in approval. With a blissful expression, he devoured the rest of his chicken sandwich. And the crust of the roasted chicken is so crispy, delicious. With a knowing wink at Decker, Tornot pondered all the things that could be made from chitin as he selected another sandwich, this time salmon, and savoured the fishy-tasting morsel. Decker had no appetite. Holmes had already formed culinary associations from past experiences. It reminds me of a dinner at Lady Mountbatten's, where I was invited last year after solving the murder case of her stable boy. They also served a chicken with vintage port. For dessert, there were exotic fruits with sherry. Well, I never, said Tornot, taking care this time that no food residue lingered at the corners of his mouth. We should be rather chuffed that our vending machine food can compete with that of a genuine English lady from the aristocracy. Absolutely. While I do find it somewhat uncouth to eat my meal standing up with my fingers, I am quite capable of adapting to local customs here. Very filling indeed, my hunger is satisfied, though I wouldn't say no to a good glass of white wine, gentlemen. Alcohol is only used for medical purposes here. To quench your thirst, you pull out this tube here and suck in a wholesome energy drink. Decker retrieved a thin, transparent tube from the machine, which he offered to a rather sceptical-looking Holmes. It's called El Toro, the bull from the arena. Very well, I shall dare it, he promised, bringing the tube to his mouth and sucking on it, swallowing cautiously, then removing the tube, barely suppressing a burp as he let the tube slide back into the machine. To be quite frank, the dining culture of your era is, to put it mildly, rather peculiar to me. As long as the calories you've consumed can motivate your brain to keep working, Tornot remarked casually whilst greedily sucking on another tube. And this splendid finger food is quite digestible too. I don't feel any heartburn or hunger, Holmes said cheerfully, except a hunger for success. Now tell me about the next murder victim before we deal with this Melwyn chap. His name was Coproc, and we found him at his workplace, reported Decker. And would you be so kind as to show him to me? Come along, we'll gladly show you where it is. Tornot hurried ahead, while Decker followed rather reluctantly. He sensed nothing pleasant awaited. Together, they got back into the lift, which took them down again. In the farthest corner of the lower deck was a gloomy chamber resembling a dungeon, as if sprung from a feverish nightmare, teeming with life. Behind a glass wall, countless insects crawled over numerous bare mounds of earth, many of them feeding on green fodder sprouting from the side walls. The vault was filled with a pungent smell and a humming noise, as if hundreds of thousands of bees were gathering honey. Yet there were no flying insects at all. They could only crawl, hop, and writhe. What do my astonished eyes behold? Holmes asked himself more than anyone else. Are these captive crickets that you listen to chirping for relaxation? Ah, I can also see locusts and large ants, spiders and other creepy crawlies. Do all these insects serve a particular purpose? Decker was just considering how to break their purpose to Holmes as gently or euphemistically as possible, but Tornot hastily preempted him with his prattle. This is our food, Mr. Holmes. We need their protein. One can process these little crawling creatures and add various flavourings so they taste like chicken, fish, or What's the matter, Mr. Holmes? You've suddenly gone quite pale. I beg your pardon? Holmes thought he must have misheard and quickly cleaned his left ear with his little finger. You cannot be serious. Yes, indeed. In our time, their protein-rich bodies are used to produce tasty provisions, which are refined with artificial flavourings and loaded into the food dispensers. Decker rolled his eyes, sensing what was about to follow. Outrageous! Holmes exclaimed in disbelief, his complexion turning even paler as his right hand clenched into a fist. You had the sheer audacity to make me consume your vermin? But Mr. Holmes, Decker tried to placate him, surely it makes no difference whether we consume animals like cows and pigs and chickens and fish, or these useful, rapidly multiplying, undemanding insects? No, it most certainly is not the same, Holmes exclaimed indignantly. You could offer such vermin to my gluttonous brother Mycroft, who would even thank you for it and praise these revolting little creatures as superb at his club. I, however, consider our collaboration terminated. Take me back to my time at once. He already stormed back to the lift that had brought them down here, ready to make good on his declaration. But you found it very tasty, my dear friend, wondered Torno, who followed him like a little puppy. With a face red with anger, Holmes suddenly and unexpectedly turned around to face him, causing Tornot to nearly run straight into him. You should have properly informed me about exactly what I was consuming, but instead you stocked this machine with entirely misleading pictures, which I consider to be an outrageous deception of my person. Do forgive us, Mr. Holmes, Decker pleaded. We consider insects to be delicacies and have been so accustomed to them for decades that it never occurred to us to give you a special notice about it, or even a trigger warning. Yes, please don't hold our oversight against us, Mr. Holmes. Tornot joined in the plea. And above all, please don't leave us now, just when your work has only begun, and when the first glimmers of light are starting to appear in the darkness of our ignorance. He even clasped his hands together as if in prayer towards heaven, although praying had long since ceased to be a human habit. People relied on technology and their own initiative rather than beseeching an invisible God for his merciful assistance, quite apart from the fact that it had rarely ever helped in any case. Holmes stood indecisively in the lift, and one could notice how he slowly regained his natural complexion as his agitation subsided. Tornot added a compliment to his request. We're both absolutely blown away by your brilliance. Very well, since you ask so kindly and you both seem genuinely sorry, I shall let mercy prevail over justice and continue to devote myself to your cases. Relieved, Tornot's hands assumed a different posture. How glad we are that you forgive us, dear Mr. Holmes. Coproc was our food procurement officer, an insect specialist. Apparently, his rather unorthodox meal, which I found quite peculiar, didn't sit well with everyone, if his death is indeed connected to his work, which I can easily imagine. As he spoke, he discreetly rubbed his stomach, mindful of its unwanted contents. I don't think so, Mr. Holmes, Decker dismissed. At any rate, no one had ever complained about the catering on board, nor about him personally. Although he was a rather peculiar fellow, he was well liked by everyone. All three of them took the lift back to the bridge. I suggest we have a bit of Midas, Tornot proposed. What do you think, sir? That's a good idea, Decker agreed, and was about to say, that makes up for your cheeky chatter earlier, but he held his tongue. Does this Midas have anything to do with insects? Inquired Holmes, who had become quite suspicious, whilst making a very defensive gesture with both hands. No, Midas is a harmless yet very effective stimulant that is taken through the nose, explained Decker, pointing to his own olfactory organ. Ho-ho, snuff, guessed Holmes, rubbing his hands together in anticipation, having had to go without his beloved pipe for so long. No, it's a dose of oxygen mixed with stimulating substances like menthol or citrus fruit, Decker explained, hoping his perceptive guest wouldn't ask for more detailed information, as he would then have had to admit that the raw materials for the stimulating substances came from Jupiter's moon Ganymede, which would likely have been hard for him to swallow as well. Here, Mr. Holmes, Tornot called out to him, handing him an oxygen mask that had dropped down from the ceiling panel above, hanging on a thin tube. Take a deep breath and you'll be amazed. It's very healthy, and what's more, a true aphrodisiac. He had already put on his mask and was eagerly inhaling the fragrant vapours. That reminds me, I must write a report about the investigation thus far, said Decker, without reaching for any of the masks. Please excuse me, my dear Holmes. Duty calls. Don't hold back on my account. I'll manage just fine, my friend. Curiously, he put on the transparent mask and inhaled. His hardened features relaxed spontaneously, and he felt a pleasantly warm sensation in his chest. The effect was far more agreeable than drawing on a cigarette. "Oh, sir," Tornot called after Decker threw the mask, which made his voice sound slightly hoarse and muffled. "Don't forget the usual safety check, you know, the nuclear fusion reactor check and all that malarkey." It sounded rather odd hearing him speak like that, almost like after inhaling sulfur hexafluoride. "Thanks, but I certainly wouldn't have forgotten that." He quickly retreated to a sectioned-off area of the bridge where a transparent column stood ready, which he entered. No sooner had he stepped inside than the column began to rotate and slowly sink into the floor. After a few minutes of inhaling Midas, Sherlock Holmes's little grey cells switched back on, as if they wanted to get back to work rather than continue being pampered by this feel-good scent called Midas. Midas was a mythical figure, a king who could turn everything he touched into gold, Holmes recalled after removing his mask. "May I ask why this odour is named thus? Is gold perhaps used in its production?" "No, not that. You just feel golden after enjoying it." Torno grinned and removed his mask as well, whereupon it was drawn back up with the other masks. "I must confess, I feel more relaxed than after indulging in tobacco or other mind-altering substances," observed Holmes, thinking of his morphine, which his friend Dr. Watson always criticised him for using, due to the unwanted side effects, namely hallucinations, sweating fits, nightmares, muscle spasms, and instability. But a true friend is always concerned about the other's health, even if it appears to them as unwanted interference. "Do you think we can question this obscure Melwyn while Mr. Decker is away?" "Certainly. That way we'll save valuable time," Tornot agreed. "Come along, let's head up to the upper deck where our lawyers hold court." Upon entering the lawyer's grand office, Holmes thought he could detect a whiff of dusty files. At an imposing desk sat a man in a mouse-grey suit with a golden paragraph symbol adorning his lapel. His roguish face, with its centre parting in light brown hair, had something cunning about it. "Dr. Melwyn, may I introduce Mr. Sherlock Holmes, so that he may also question you?" Tornot got straight to the point of his visit, as he knew perfectly well that Melwyn couldn't stand it when someone beat around the bush. "Delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Holmes," said Melwyn, rising from his chair, which sank into the floor. "Have you managed to narrow down the circle of suspects to a single target?" "My investigations have not progressed that far yet. I still lack the crucial evidence," Holmes informed him matter-of-factly. He sized up the man before him as a cold-blooded careerist who would be willing to do quite a lot for his own advantage. "And what would those be?" "Among other things, the reason why you were so aggressive towards Captain Beauregard when you interrupted his harmless tête-à-tête with the charming Talita in the private sector," Holmes told him bluntly. "I was not aggressive!" Melwyn roared and flinched, as he realised that he had lost control of himself for a moment. "I apologise, Mr. Holmes. My temper rarely gets the better of me. It has nothing to do with the case, or rather, the cases." "What do you mean? Your temper or your aggression back then?" Holmes wanted to know precisely. "Both. It was about Beauregard's special requests." "Oh, really?" "What special requests?" asked Tornot, perplexed. "Oh, yes. You wouldn't know anything about that, of course." With a smug expression on his face, Melwyn briefly turned away, went to the back, and retrieved a CD from one of the filing cabinets. "What is this peculiar round object?" Holmes naturally couldn't be familiar with such a data storage device. "A discus for physical exercise in the office?" "This is a storage medium, rather like an infinitely large piece of paper on which one can record all sorts of important and unimportant things, with images in the text that can be brought to lifelike motion." Melwyn explained the function of hologram CDs to him, briefly holding his CD up in the air like a winner with their medal. "Might I have a look at that?" asked Holmes, already eager to see these supposedly lifelike images. "Since you're so keen, I certainly won't keep it from you." Melwyn promptly inserted the CD into a slot in his desk, whereupon a life-sized hologram of the captain appeared. His splendid uniform gave him a distinguished appearance. Slightly unsettled, Holmes looked at Tornot, who nodded and pointed out, "These are the blessings of our technology. This is a so-called hologram of the deceased. But there are also holograms of living people, a comfort for those who suffer too greatly from the absence of their loved ones." Then Beauregard's hologram began to speak. "Listen carefully, Melwyn. I won't tell you again. You'll do exactly what I tell you to do, and without telling anyone. I intend to launch a secret project." At this point, he briefly showed the victory sign with his right hand, "with which I aim to do mankind a great service. I'm not interested in costs, regulations, or your irrelevant opinions, because I'm concerned with rapid progress, and I certainly won't achieve that if I follow every single unnecessary regulation to the letter. Have you got that?" The hologram vanished again. Holmes couldn't help himself. He felt as though he had seen a ghost, which they now called a hologram. Yet it seemed to be quite commonplace nowadays to surround oneself with such spirits, for whatever reasons. "And what was this secret project about?" Holmes probed further, forcing his full concentration back onto the case, or rather, onto a possible solution to it. "He couldn't tell me that. He said he first needed to sort out a few things with his adjutant." "And that's why you were angry?" "No, Mr. Holmes. I was angry that he tried to intimidate me like that. I know my duties perfectly well and don't need anyone to dress me down like old Beauregard did." At this, Melwyn stamped his foot, as if regressing into an early childhood tantrum phase. "Most illuminating," Holmes rejoiced. "It's just a shame that his adjutant can't tell us anything more about it." "Oh, really?" "Yes, he's vanished into thin air. He died in the particle accelerator." Tornot briefly shook his head, as if he still couldn't believe it. "Or at least, that's where they disposed of him." Melwyn nodded in agreement. "I've never heard of anything like that. What is it? A particle accelerator?" "That's a brilliant invention," Melwyn whispered to him, although Tornot could obviously hear it. "In the past, they used to call this particle accelerator the infernal machine." "Stop with these ancient, crazy-sounding illusions!" Tornot scolded him and pulled his shoulders back to thrust out his chest. "Hell machine," repeated Holmes cluelessly, looking back and forth between Melwyn and Tornot, hoping the latter would provide some clarification. A particle accelerator is, roughly speaking, a machine in which tiny particles are smashed together at high speeds to create new ones. Should any living being get inside whilst it's switched on, it would lead to their rapid pulverization. "Infernal machine," Melwyn now repeated triumphantly, as if the second officer had confirmed this designation with his explanation of how it worked. "That does indeed sound hellish," Holmes had to admit. Without this groundbreaking invention, many of the conveniences in our lives would never have become possible. With a gesture, as if wanting to fan Melwyn away, Tornot continued, "Is there anything else useful on your CD, or was that all?" That was why I was rather angry, because Beauregard was taking too many liberties, not just with me, but as captain of this ship. He was acting as if he were the Almighty himself. "What do you think he wanted to create?" "Oh, Mr. Holmes, I'm afraid I cannot answer that, as he did not share any details about this secret project with me." "At least a possible motive is now becoming clear," Holmes deduced with razor-sharp precision. "The murderer struck because both Beauregard and his adjutant knew too much about this project." "Ha ha ha!" Melwyn rejoiced. "And I'm possibly still alive because he didn't tell me anything about it." As he spoke, he tapped his chest with all his fingertips. "That sounds plausible," Holmes agreed. "I've heard quite enough," said Tornot in a rather dismissive tone, for he could not bear his captain being disparaged in such a way, especially by a lawyer who was supposed to represent the crew in all matters. "Right then, let's go." Holmes agreed to end the brief interrogation. Hardly had they left Melwyn's office when Tornot inquired, "Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of this case so far?" "Well, I can say with absolute certainty that I have never seen a case quite like this one, nor have I ever heard of anything similar. The second officer didn't find this answer particularly enlightening. Back on the bridge, Holmes silently recapped everything he had heard so far whilst pacing up and down. Then he stopped, raised an index finger in the air as if something important had occurred to him, and turned back to Tornot. "Mr. Tornot, you mentioned that this obscure Project 5 was on the penultimate page of the logbook. What was actually on the last page?" "Just a moment, let's check," he announced, fetched the logbook and scrolled to the last page. "Rolke's dismissal went unpleasantly. Apparently thinks himself irreplaceable. Seems to have a prominent supporter in management." I see, most enlightening. Who is this Rolke?" "It's actually a she, a red-haired warrior woman who leads our combat robot task force," he explained. "Looks hot, but she's only interested in certain men, if you catch my drift." He gave Holmes a very meaningful look, who drew his own conclusions about that. "Ah, who are you talking about?" asked Decker, who had meanwhile returned from his trip to attend to pending duties, emerged from the raised column and wanted to be informed. "Surely not about our nemesis?" "I'm afraid so, sir. Captain Beauregard mentioned her on the last page of his logbook. Apparently he gave her a formal warning, for whatever reason. I've always suspected she was protected by the leadership." "Who hasn't?" "Holmes and I have already questioned Melwyn during your absence, who spoke very negatively about Captain Beauregard's secret project, though he didn't know any specifics about it." "We ought to have a word with this Amazon," Holmes suggested. Done. They found Rolke in a hall on the middle deck, where she was using a small metal oil can to lubricate the arm joints of one of the combat robots, which knelt before her and still measured 2 meters tall. As soon as she spotted the trio consisting of Decker, Tornot and Holmes, she dismissed the robot, had it line up in a row with others of its kind, and set aside the small oil can. A sharp metallic smell pervaded the air here. "What distinguished visitors!" she chirped in a slightly higher-pitched voice. Her thick red hair was braided into several plaits that stuck out from her head. At present, she wore yellow shorts, a black belt and a blue uniform jacket, along with heavy black combat boots adorned with a yellow lightning bolt on the outer side. She gave the impression of someone ready to instantly stamp the profile of her boots across the face of any attacker. One might have called her a Valkyrie, for her height matched that of Holmes and the first officer, and her broad shoulders had something distinctly masculine about them. "Mr. Holmes wanted to meet you, Rolke. I hope we're not disturbing you," said Decker. "We certainly don't want to do that," affirmed Tornot, who didn't want to get on her bad side. "Hardly. What can I do for our guest from the past? Shall I show him our way of warfare? When we take him back, he could quite possibly change history with it." "Rolke, you know perfectly well that such a request goes against our ethics. We are here because Mr. Sherlock Holmes would like to ask you a few brief questions." Decker positioned himself to her left, his second officer to her right, and Holmes stood directly in front of her. "That could almost make me scared," she joked and pulled a brief grimace. "Just little old me against 3 grown men." "Well, your combat robots would surely intervene in your favour straight away," Tornot grumbled. "Lady Rolke," began Holmes, even hinting at a slight bow. "Oh my, no man has ever called me a lady before," she remarked with evident pleasure. "I rather like that. What would you like to know, sir?" And rather unpleasant odour wafted from her mouth towards him. "Well, it surely hasn't escaped your attention that your captain met an untimely and unnatural end." Holmes spoke in his characteristically refined manner, not letting on that he found her breath repulsive. "Exactly. Word of that has already reached me," she admitted with a mischievous expression. "And I'll confess straight away that I couldn't stand him. And that, despite Mr. Decker's claims that he was, and, I quote verbatim, a mild, fair superior, just as one could wish for. Strange." "Yes, I think so too," said Tornot. "Sometimes he didn't have such a mild manner, or even such an exceptionally polite way about him as you do, Mr. Holmes," she admitted to him with a serious expression. "We often held completely opposing views, and that bothered him so much that he, how shall I put this delicately, gave me an earful several times. Ahem! Holmes made an indignant sound, as if something had caught in his windpipe. Most interesting, what you consider to be refined language, Lady Rolka. She grinned briefly, and then became more specific. He told me quite frankly that he thought my working methods were absolute rubbish. He certainly didn't say it like that, Decker hissed at her from the side. Were you there? She asked, eyeing him provocatively. As far as I can remember, I was standing with him in the private sector, which is mercifully free of surveillance cameras. Security cameras? Holmes repeated, bewildered. Quite right, my dear sir, Rolka chimed in. A man from your century wouldn't know anything about that yet, so listen carefully. We're all being filmed wherever we go. Oh, of course you wouldn't know about that, which means we're constantly being photographed. Lady Rolka, you seem to have forgotten that silent films have existed since 1895, and the breakthrough in serial photography was achieved by my fellow countryman Edward Muybridge back in 1872. He lectured her sternly. He proved in this way that a galloping horse occasionally lifts all four hooves off the ground. Fine then. We are constantly being filmed so that nothing we do remains hidden. Except, of course, in the private sector I mentioned earlier, which is located on the upper deck, where one can chat quite casually and unobserved, just like in your time, unless someone was eavesdropping at the door. What do you say to that? Now this battle-axe had led him onto the trail of the erased tapes, Decker thought irritably. You haven't told me anything about that yet, Mr. Decker. This opens up entirely new aspects. Holmes was already looking forward to some help with the perplexing case. I'm afraid not, my dear fellow, because these films, that is, the many photographs, were deleted again by an unknown person, or an unknown person. At this point he shot an angry glance at Rolka, as if they had never existed. That is rather annoying, though of course, in that case, you wouldn't have needed my help. He 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 he! Rolka laughed shrilly. I find it rather amusing that Decker needs your help. Well, you also need the help of your combat robots. Decker put her in her place. Lady Rolka, as a militarist, you of all people should know that one must never underestimate an enemy. He studied her reaction with a piercing gaze, but she remained unmoved. In any case, what was the last thing the captain demanded of you? That I should hand in my resignation due to disproportionate use of force. He thought I'd liquidated too many insurgents from the rebellious settlers during our last mission on Gliese 581G, but I was only doing my duty. Nothing more, nothing less. As she spoke, she thrust her chest forward slightly, pulled in her stomach, and moved one booted foot closer to Holmes. And what did you say to that? He inquired, not budging a millimetre from his position. That he could go and... Rolka! Decker warned, already dreading the familiar Guts quotation which, like many other things, simply never went out of fashion. Report to management. She toned down and pulled a grimace that exposed her impeccably white teeth. At that moment, she gave a very predatory impression. Because you thought nothing could happen to you. Isn't that right, Lady Rolka? You're quite confident about your responsible position here, and don't fear being replaced any time soon. You've got it, Mr. Holmes, she praised him and put her foot back down. I am always sure of myself, and the management greatly appreciates that. As she spoke, she placed her hands on her hips and lifted her head so high that water would have run into her nostrils had it been raining. Did you meet him again after that? No, neither of us had any desire for another meeting. I can understand that, Tornot remarked. Right then, I'd like to thank you for now for your enlightening answers to my questions, Lady Rolka, said Holmes as he turned to leave. You're most welcome. Do come visit me again, sir. In the lift, Tornot remarked. She's a one-woman wrecking crew, wouldn't you say, Mr. Holmes? I found the smell from her mouth most unpleasant. She reeked of sulphur, Holmes observed. That must be what hell smells like. That's from the tablets, Decker explained. Yes, exactly, Tornot agreed. Oh, women here have to take pills? Ones that smell of sulphur? No, it's that there are tablets for ladies that promote muscle growth, making them equal to men in physical strength. And these tablets are called Stramfix and have sulphurous breath as a side effect. Interesting. What exists? What will exist? Holmes corrected himself, somewhat lost in thought. Perhaps she became too pushy with Beauregard, Tourneau suggested a motive. Hardly. As he would have noted that down, I'm convinced. No, his death must be connected to this ominous project. And why didn't you ask Rolke about it then? Inquired Decker with a slightly reproachful tone. We must be careful with mentioning this mysterious project, which we don't know whether it's called V or Roman numeral 5. And wait, for the murderer should give himself away with it. Holmes raised his eyebrows meaningfully. I see, said Tourneau, narrowing his eyes. Beauregard never actually used Roman numerals. He did, though. Decker contradicted him. For instance, during the Alpha Centauri mission, where he divided the task forces into Roman numerals 1, 11, and 111 in the deployment plan. Ah, yes, I remember. However, it could have been that he decided to do so for the first time. Holmes often couldn't help but have the last word. Back on the bridge, Holmes vented his anger. That's the most conceited, pompous person I've ever met. Looks like Medusa with her snake-headed braids. If the dead had been turned to stone, we wouldn't need to keep looking for the murderer. Ha ha, you really are quite the comedian, Tourneau said, amused. If our ginger Amazon heard you say that, you'd be in for some action straight away. Speaking of red hair, Holmes interjected hotly at this trigger word. I recall a case in my memoirs called the Red-Headed League, a truly fascinating case. You see, a pawnbroker, I'll discreetly withhold his name, was made aware of a peculiar advertisement by his assistant. In it, a so-called League of Red-Headed Men offered the enormous wage of £4 per week for simple part-time work. The requirement: the applicant must have bright red hair and must not leave the office during working hours under any circumstances. He gets the position. From then on, he spends 4 hours every day in the League's office, during which time he copies out the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Very industrious, remarked Decker. Oh yes. Meanwhile, his assistant takes care of the pawn shop. But on the morning of 9th of October 1890, everything is different. When he arrives, he finds only a note on the door with the terse message that the League has been dissolved. There's no trace of his supervisor, the name was false, and nobody in the building had ever heard of the League. Furious about losing his well-paid position, he makes his way to me. And you solved the case, of course, Decker declared. Of course. I immediately had the justified suspicion that the whole Red-Headed League business was a ruse to get the pawnbroker out of the house for several hours each day. During this time, the perpetrators dug the tunnel to the bank directly adjacent to the pawn shop. The trick with the League, the suspect's trouser knees worn through from digging, and the proximity of the pawn shop to the bank put me on the right track. But that's just by the by. This Amazon has set something in motion with me, an unpleasant contemporary of yours. Well, Mr. Holmes, said Tourneau, I'm afraid you'll find such an unpleasant element in every army. Gender makes no difference. Oh yes, it does, Mr. Tourneau, Holmes contradicted immediately, because ladies prefer to work with poison. Decker gazed pensively through the windscreen of the Ultimo 1. Project Phi might have something to do with a new weapon. Oh, and is it customary for the captain not to discuss his intention to commission a new weapon with his officers beforehand? Holmes wondered. He's not wrong there, Tourneau agreed, looking at Decker and thinking briefly. But it could also mean that he was just referring to an upgrade of an existing weapon system, which he kept secret from us to prevent Rolke from finding out. He could have simply sworn you to secrecy if he'd told you about it in this private sector, Holmes deduced. Decker turned abruptly towards him and explained. No, that would be against the regulations that bind us together as a trinity. Aha, so you, Mr. Tourneau and Lady Rolke, are something of a terrible trio when it comes to fighting enemies and arming fellow combatants. Please don't call Rolka lady, Tornot demanded. That would be like calling a combat robot a tin soldier. Yes, that's correct. We must get along with each other, otherwise it could lead to internal tensions, which would naturally result in inefficient combat effectiveness. With an expression as if he were standing before the dead captain, Decker added, I've always had to force myself to work with Rolka, but I don't believe she's capable of murder. It goes completely against her sense of honour. Besides, with her good connections, she could have simply turned opinion against Beauregard at headquarters. Oh, murder is much simpler, Mr. Decker. Consider that this woman possesses an unusually high confidence in her abilities, as if she could win a war all by herself. That's true as well. Let's briefly summarise. Ship's engineer Tomek died. Captain Beauregard, Research Officer Forsk, Koprock, the insect specialist, and who was the fifth body? That adjutant, I presume? Well, Mr. Holmes, this is rather delicate, as a fifth corpse doesn't actually exist, since it was practically pulverised. Tornot felt a chill, despite the very pleasant temperature aboard, as he imagined this procedure. Are you saying the poor man was put through a sieve while still alive? Holmes didn't even want to imagine such a horrific scene. We don't know that. It's possible that he was disposed of in this manner only after his heart stopped beating. Decker also felt something like a shiver. His name was Doyle. He was the captain's adjutant, the last to die, and was actually meant to be replaced by a robot in his role. But the captain absolutely insisted on keeping his human adjutant. It suddenly struck Tornot how unusual this wish of Beauregard's was, since robots generally completed tasks much faster, more reliably, and without complaining about anything. The captain always seemed so fatherly when he was with him. Interesting. Could be important later, Holmes muttered. I noticed that too, Decker pondered. Sometimes he spoke to him as if he were speaking to a son. And this man was called Doyle. That name sounds somewhat familiar to me, mused Holmes. Ah, never mind. We must now go through the sequence of deaths again in detail. For this, I need a precise layout of the locations where they were found, plus the time of their deaths and when their mortal remains were discovered. I would like to think about this alone in a room. Holmes massaged his temples with both index fingers, for despite his adaptability, he found it harder to concentrate here in this enormous spaceship than within his own four walls and in his own era. I have an inkling of a solution. I shall now seek out one of those quiet mirrored spots again. But Mr. Holmes, no smoking again, Tornot reminded him. That only earned him a nasty look. As soon as he had left, Decker had the requested documents printed out. It took less than a minute before he had everything in his hands. I could explain to him how to use a hologram first, but I think he'll manage better with this two-dimensional plan he asked for. I suggest we give him the guest suite right here near the bridge as accommodation, said Tornot. Very comfortable and furnished in a somewhat old-fashioned style. He'll feel almost at home there with the red plush armchairs. We can't in good conscience leave him alone, as the murderer might already have him in their sights. Otherwise, we risk him becoming our sixth corpse, Decker whispered to his deputy, as if afraid the enemy might be listening to their conversation at that very moment. But if the murderer underestimates him, like Dr. Z did, then we needn't worry about him. Tornot saw no absolute necessity for it. We are responsible for him, consider that, and it would be an unauthorised interference with his time if he couldn't return. All those undiscovered villains could continue to rampage, and innocent people who are important for the development and progress of humanity could die. Oh, we could build a robot double, or, if necessary, turn him into a purely literary character. Tornot looked so triumphant, as if he had rediscovered Columbus's egg with his suggestions. And all the people around him too, I suppose. Don't talk such nonsense, and instead arrange for discreet surveillance using a drone in the form of a fly that can camouflage itself and alert us if needed. There was a slight hint of anger in Decker's voice. Yes, sir. Perhaps you should remind him of our deadline. Time is running out. Good thinking. I'll do that at the next opportunity." When Holmes returned to them with relief, they led him to this aforementioned comfortable, very luxurious guest suite. The interior consisted of wall-mounted cabinets, partly styled in mahogany, several dark red plush armchairs with high backs, an imposing antique-looking wooden table on which Decker placed the documents Holmes had requested, and a screen between the cabinets which currently remained black. "This is our finest guest room," Decker offered as his temporary accommodation. "Here on the wall you'll see what we call a screen, which can display all sorts of things. To avoid any distractions, it can show you the image of a famous painting. Which one would you like to have hanging on your wall, my dear fellow? After all, we want you to feel at home here. If you're asking me, I'd like one by John Constable, preferably Salisbury Cathedral from the Bishop's Grounds circa 1825. No sooner had he spoken than the very same cathedral appeared, framed by lovely countryside. Looking at it calmed Holmes, who felt deeply connected to his homeland. "Indeed, an excellent choice," praised Tornot, and, whilst Holmes was distracted, released a small drone fly from his hand, which settled unnoticed on one of the walls. "Formidable, how my talented countryman could delight the eye with his romantic painting," Holmes mused, while gazing at the artwork. "Oh, what wonderful qualities some people possess, if only they didn't harbour evil in their deepest core. As far as I can judge your era and its seemingly incredible achievements, I would say that while I can credit you with remarkable technical capabilities, I must object that the people of your time are no better than those of mine." A moment of silence ensued, during which the two officers had to digest this verdict. "Mr. Holmes, I forgot to mention," Decker came to the crucial point, "that we don't have unlimited time. The longer we stay in the same wrong century, the greater the energy drop in our drive becomes, until we can no longer leave under our own power. And this point will be reached in 7 hours and 8 minutes. I see, Mr. Decker. So you must change centuries, but not necessarily travel back to the future." Holmes sought to verify whether he had understood correctly. He couldn't allow himself to draw any wrong conclusions. He always took great care with this. It was one of his secrets to success. "You caught on quickly," Tornot praised him. "Surely you won't need long to solve these cases completely." "I share that view," confirmed Decker, "for it would not serve any case well to attempt solving it in a different century." "Of course not." Holmes looked around his new lodgings with satisfaction. "And, since I don't need to sleep, I'll quickly get closer to the solution if you entrust me with Captain Beauregard's private logbook. Naturally, I'll keep everything I read in it to myself, unless it's of general interest to solving the case." "Agreed. I'll have Elmer bring it to you." "We'll leave you alone now, Mr. Holmes," Tornot announced. "But don't be surprised if some of the furniture here seems to have a mind of its own. It's all just for your comfort." "I'm quite used to things by now, since you brought me here." Holmes appeared rather unimpressed, and was already spreading the documents across the table, whilst also taking the photograph of the deceased Captain Beauregard and that of ship's engineer Pomej from his coat pocket before removing his coat and hat. "Speaking of ship's engineers, I recall the case which I entrusted to my memoirs under the title The Engineer's Thumb. In the summer of 1889, a hydraulic engineer of barely 25 years appeared at Watson's practice very early in the morning, having lost a thumb during the night. As he spoke of an attempted murder, Watson immediately involved me and reported, "Mr. Holmes, I hate to interrupt you, as it shows a certain rudeness, but since we are in a hurry, I would suggest—" "That I should be brief, Mr. Decker?" "Gladly. I was reminded of a missing persons notice from about a year ago, where another hydraulic engineer was reported missing, who was also last seen late in the evening. With a Scotland Yard inspector and a detective, I immediately travelled to Eyford with Dr. Watson and the victim. Based on several clues, I deduced that the crime scene was quite nearby. The hour-long carriage ride was merely meant to obscure this fact. We encountered a gang of counterfeiters operating on a large scale, whose trail had gone cold in Reading. A column of smoke in the vicinity of the railway station led me to the suspect's house. The fire must have been triggered by the oil lamp when it got caught in the hydraulic press. The gang had, of course, long since fled. Even I couldn't apprehend them, though the fire brigade at the scene was puzzled by the large quantities of nickel and tin they found. "Mr. Holmes," Decker interjected, slightly irritated, "please save your energy for solving our case. Thank you in advance." Decisively, he left the suite together with Tornot, who would have been happy to listen further. Hardly had the door closed behind Decker and Tornot when the latter said, "I'm on tenterhooks to see whether our antique guest will finally prove worthy of his reputation, which he keeps reinforcing with his elaborate tales." Decker merely said, Yes, don't forget to get him Beauregard's logbook." "Understood, sir." A short while later, the busy Elmer appeared with the logbook at Holmes's side. Holmes took it, scrolled through it, read it, then alternately looked at the site plan and the photograph of the captain. He muttered, scratching the back of his head. "I'll sit down and go through everything again carefully and with proper concentration. There are plenty of armchairs available. I'll fetch one. I want to be comfortable." As he was about to turn around to pull one of the plush armchairs closer to the table, one of them had already eagerly rolled towards him and came to a stop right behind him, its momentum lifting Holmes straight onto its seat. "Oh, how practical," said Holmes as he sat down comfortably, though remaining sceptical and adding cautiously, "Now stay put." "Very well, sir," confirmed the armchair with a synthetic voice. "Well, I never. The furniture can even talk here." Somewhat irritated, Holmes paused briefly before asking, "I don't suppose you know who committed the murders, Chair?" "I'm afraid not, sir," the Chair replied politely. "I don't understand the question. I'm only programmed to follow simple commands." "What luck, otherwise I'd feel rather redundant." Meanwhile, Decker and Tornot visited the portly Dr. Z, who wasn't everyone's cup of tea, in his health centre beneath the bridge. "How's our relic from ancient times doing?" he asked, with an expression as if suffering from severe indigestion. "Is he making excessive demands? Does he perhaps want to save the Queen from natural selection, or even succeed her, as King Sherlock won?" "Neither, dear doctor," Tornot said acidly. "So far he hasn't expressed any such demanding wishes." "I believe he will do so yet," prophesied Dr. Z, leaning against his operating computer, into which one only needed to lie down to receive fully automated treatment. Nevertheless, he was quite aware of his own importance, as he could make the tiniest necessary adjustments or install new tools at any time, depending on the prevailing situation aboard. "Don't be so hostile towards him," Decker scolded him. "He started it," the doctor reminded him. In doing so, he seemed like a defiant little boy quarrelling with a playmate in the sandbox, whilst explaining his actions to his mummy. "Perhaps there's something like reincarnation and you've met him before in a duel that he lost," Tornot joked, briefly baring his teeth. "Ha! The doctor laughed heartily. "I'm glad you both find this amusing," Decker remarked. "Well, Decker, laughter is the best medicine and the ideal prevention against burnout. Speaking of which, I've heard through the grapevine that they're planning to elect a new captain soon." "Really?" Decker hissed through his teeth, naturally displeased with this news. "And have my opposing candidates already been determined?" "Yes, I'm afraid it will be the usual suspects. First up would be Ralbo from our legal department." Dr. Z listed the first one. "Oh no, not that bean counter," Tornot blurted out. "Working under him wouldn't be any fun at all." "Out, and who else is applying?" Decker inquired, his blood pressure rising as he found it extremely inappropriate that barely after poor Beauregard, or rather his mortal remains, had been mummified and frozen for eternity, something akin to a war of succession was already threatening to develop. Then there's also Brunswick from the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs, who might be in the running, although he hasn't made it public yet, but I know him. And of course, also, Rolka, who loves being in command. "I'm stunned," Decker reluctantly admitted. "That's the creme de la creme on board who will be going head-to-head with me." "With all due respect, sir, I hardly believe any of those mentioned stand even the slightest chance against you. Tornot fawned over his superior. Especially if Holmes truly unmasks the culprit behind our predicament, Dr. Z pointed out. And that should happen rather soon. After all, he has already realised that we are extremely well equipped on board, yet we're not much better than the people of his time. Tornot shrugged. Is that all the snobbish Neanderthal in the checkered cape has discovered? Dr. Z remarked spitefully. Where was his usual brilliance? Patience, Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say. Nevertheless, Tornot, you ought to hurry him along, advised the doctor. Well, but first, we need to dash down to the cargo hold to check on our precious cargo, Decker announced. I'll come along, suggested Dr. Z, as you might need medical. Medical assistance will certainly come in handy. In the cargo hold of Ultimo 1, there were several cages with glass walls reinforced by metal bars. Inside these glass prisons crouched the Terrans, a genetic mixture of human and animal, who had black, reptilian-like skin marked with varying numbers of white spots. The number of spots visible on their scaly skin depended on their mood. Ah, Dr. Z observed with relief. Just a few spots on their upper body. That means they're quite relaxed. That can change quickly, as we know. Tornot couldn't warm to these creatures, who were all exactly 6 feet 3 inches tall and slim, similar to humans. Their heads were adorned with fringe-like strips of skin, and their eyes glowed yellow like those of cats. They're just playing innocent lambs to us. They are genetically incapable of pretending, Dr. Z lectured. Like animals, they openly display whatever mood they're in. Shouldn't we have informed Holmes that we're bringing these peculiar beings aboard from our excursion to Kepler 452b? Asked Tornot. Hardly, since these unruly beasts aren't the reason why 5 of our crew had to die. They're securely contained here, which means they can't fall under suspicion themselves. But they're not averse to meat, Dr. Z reminded them, pointing to his protruding belly. Much like myself, as it happens. Good doctor, you are not a cannibal, and these creatures receive enough meat substitute to, as we can all see, remain quite peaceful. I hope you're not mistaken about that, Decker, muttered Dr. Z, tapping timidly on the glass of one of the cages. Immediately, one of the Tyrones jumped up and opened its terrifying maw with its pointed, razor-sharp little teeth, whilst the number of white spots on its body increased considerably. It looked as though it were descended from a Dalmatian, only far less cute than one. I don't know why, but that fellow somehow reminds me of Rolka, Tornot noticed. If she's after command of the ship, that's what Holmes would call a motive. In that case, she would have eliminated the other candidates for the coveted top position straight away, rather than the harmless adjutant, the research officer who was so useful to us, the ship's engineer and our insect specialist. That's true, Tornot had to admit. Unless Holmes is right and all the other murders are just diversionary tactics, the woman is certainly ruthless enough for that. As far as I know, Rolka was having an affair with Forsk and was genuinely devastated when he got killed, reported Dr. Z. While it goes against my doctor-patient confidentiality, I'll tell you this in strict confidence. He paused dramatically to ensure he had his listeners' full attention. She came to see me right after she learned of his violent death and asked me for antidepressants. We should report this to Holmes straight away, Tornot said cheerfully. In strict confidence, of course, though as an Englishman, he's quite used to complete discretion. No, let's leave him undisturbed to think for a while. Meanwhile, Holmes had thoroughly racked his brain about how everything was connected, and seemed to have reached at least a preliminary conclusion with which he was evidently pleased. Yes, indeed, this conclusion practically forces itself upon one with vehemence, he whispered, as if fearing his furniture might somehow relay his words to the suspect. When he tried to get up, he realised the armchair had properly wedged him against the table. Chair, I wish to stand up. At once, the armchair moved slightly backwards and released Holmes, who stood up and cast a critical look at the chair. Back to your place, Chair, commanded Holmes. Obediently, The armchair followed and returned to its original position. Now I shall check whether the captain has some good alcohol stashed away here for enjoyment after all. Oh, how I would love to drink a fine cognac. No sooner had he said that when one of the wall cabinets opened and a bottle of cognac presented itself on an extendable tray. Next to it, a suitable cognac snifter was already waiting. "What did I tell you?" Holmes rejoiced, poured himself a full glass, sniffed, and took a small sip before finally emptying the glass with great pleasure. "Ah!" he exclaimed as he set down the glass. As he pondered, he thought about his last meeting with Dr. Watson, with whom he had celebrated New Year's Eve. What might Watson be doing right now? Will he believe this story, or will he say, "Now stop it, enough of this nonsense, put an end to it"? No sooner had he uttered the word "stop" than the tray with the bottle and glass was pulled back and the cabinet closed again. Ah, so that was the command for clearing away. Holmes went to the table and scrutinised his documents once more. Yes, that must be exactly how it happened. I'd better touch wood. As if on cue, Decker knocked on the door of the guest suite and eagerly entered with Tornot. Though pulled from his thoughts, Holmes still put on a pleased expression, as he believed he could soon deliver an important report to his hosts. "Gentlemen, I believe I have found the solution, although I cannot yet say anything about the motive." "Well, at least, the solution is what matters, and you found it without even smoking your beloved pipe." Tornot couldn't resist taking a little dig. "Tornot, don't," Decker warned him, but Holmes ignored it. Standing with outstretched arms in front of the document spread across the table, he pointed to a spot on the site plan and then raised his index finger in the air. "First, we must ask ourselves what we have. We have 5 deaths, but only 4 bodies. So naturally, I ask myself, where is your proof that a 5th murder even took place?" Tornot muttered, somewhat helplessly. "We only found Doyle's boots in front of the particle accelerator, with its hatch wide open. Speaking of which," Holmes began reminiscing, "this reminds me of the story of the blue carbuncle. After witnessing a mugging, a hotel porter happened to find only a felt hat and a Christmas goose, inside which was a valuable gem, that very blue carbuncle. It turned out that this had been stolen from a countess's hotel room just days before. My only lead was the found felt hat. However, that was quite sufficient for me to track down the thief." "You're a genius," Tornot praised him. "Back to the person murdered in the particle accelerator," Decker reminded them impatiently. Oh yes, it was completely empty inside, so we logically assumed Doyle had been disposed of in this machine," Tornot completed. "And why didn't our murderer dispose of the victim's boots just as thoroughly? Why didn't he make the effort to simply dispose of all the previous victims there?" "So you think Doyle only faked his death?" Decker asked, making sure he had followed the detective's line of thought correctly. "Even more than that. If he has done this, then he is almost certainly our wanted murderer." "Brilliant," Tornot had to admit. "We would never have figured that out." "Tornot." "I beg your pardon, sir. Are you referring to the killer's plan as brilliant, or my deduction?" Holmes wanted to know. "Well, or actually both. I find it hard to imagine that Doyle could have concocted such a devious plan," Decker muttered. "Certainly not." "And I can't imagine it at all," admitted Tornot, completely baffled. "He wasn't nearly that cunning. Rather submissive towards our captain," Decker mused. "Mr. Tornot, you said that Captain Beauregard had always seemed rather fatherly in his dealings with that Adjutant Doyle." "Yes, that's quite right. And just look at his completely surprised face in the photograph showing his corpse," Holmes suggested, pointing to it with his finger. "Almost as if he's asking, 'You too, my son, Brutus?'" "Oh, that's just how he always looked," Tornot dismissed. "No, he didn't," Decker objected. "How can you even suggest such a thing?" "Yes, that's what I thought," remarked Holmes somewhat sympathetically. "Tornot, you have no eye for all the different possibilities of human facial expressions. I, on the other hand, can read faces like open books. There are all sorts of expressions for every possible mood a person might be in. One must discover these before the person even speaks a word, or rather, before they can speak, in our sad murder case. "Rubbish!" snapped Tornot, who was clearly irritated at being found wanting in any way. For until now, he had thought himself master of virtually every skill necessary for success. "Don't worry about it," Decker consoled him. "You're still a bright spark on board here." Suddenly, the light began to flicker, only very briefly, for about 2 milliseconds. Yet this showed that technology, with all its sophistication, wasn't quite as reliable as Decker and Tornot thought, even though they had to believe in its infallibility to entrust their lives to a massive piece of shape memory metal, capable of gliding through space and even time. Concerned, Holmes looked up at the ceiling, which showed no visible oil lamp, lantern, or crystal chandelier, but only illuminated surfaces. "Well, well, could there be a hole in the gas pipe? Will we soon be fumbling about in the dark?" "We haven't used gas for a long time, Mr. Holmes," Tornot explained, rolling his eyes, as he kept forgetting that Holmes had missed many developments. "I have a suspicion," Decker chimed in. "If Doyle is still alive, he must have evaded the omnipresent surveillance cameras, and that's really only possible in the private sector. I wonder if he's lurking around there," Tornot pondered. "Could it be that he might have found a way to make himself invisible?" Holmes inquired. "Some novel machine." "Invisible? Do you mean just for the cameras or invisible altogether? Physical invisibility?" Decker wondered. "Ha!" exclaimed Holmes, placing a hand on his furrowed brow. "That's it!" "What is it?" asked Tornot impatiently. "Don't keep us in suspense, my friend. Tell us quickly." "The project is called V for vanishing, disappearing. That's what he wanted, and he nearly managed it, to disappear without a trace." Holmes clapped his hands once, excited by his own logical success. Then Elmer emerged from one of the cupboards along the wall and asked, as polite as ever, "Did Mr. Holmes call for me?" "What? Oh yes, bring me another cup of your delicious tea, Elmer." "Very well, sir." "Vanishing?" Tornot repeated questioningly. "The physical invisibility simply cannot work, Mr. Holmes," said Decker. "For medical reasons, you see. Since I cannot consult Dr. Watson about this, I must ask you to explain it to me in more detail," Holmes requested with an eager look. "Quite simple. Since total invisibility would also make the retina invisible, from a medical science standpoint, we must assume that our invisible person would then be blind. This would, however, considerably limit their radius of action." "Exactly," Tornot agreed. "An invisible blind man can't accomplish much." "Of course, that makes perfect sense to me. There must be a way to eliminate this problem. I shall ponder this over tea, gentlemen. And now, the two of us will head to the private sector to check the blind spots, to see if he used them to escape into the interior of Ultimo 1. Decker was already running ahead at high speed. "Wait for me, sir!" Tornot darted after the first officer like lightning. "Finally, things are starting to move along." Decker was already in the lift. "Just not in the way we'd hoped. If Doyle is still alive and lurking somewhere on the ship, what exactly is he trying to achieve? It's impossible for me to put myself into the seemingly sick mind of an insubordinate adjutant, Tornot." Holmes savoured his well-deserved tea in the guest suite and gazed longingly at Constable's painting flickering on the screen, standing before it with his cup as if he could instantly transport himself into the romantic landscape of Salisbury. Then, as if from nowhere, a man suddenly appeared who looked naked, with two dark, piercing, rat-like eyes gleaming in his face, and he crept up to Holmes as quietly as a little mouse. Holmes had not yet noticed him, as he was still completely enchanted, absorbed in contemplating the painting, or rather, its image on the screen. "Holmes!" exclaimed the intruder, pulling back his upper lip to reveal a row of pearly white teeth. "Who might you be?" asked Holmes, after turning towards the stranger, although he clearly suspected the name of the uninvited visitor. "Those like me have no name," evaded the man, who wore a flesh-coloured bodysuit, displayed a pinched expression and held a strange metallic object in his right hand, similar to a small pistol of the sort once made for ladies, avoiding a polite introduction of himself. "But I know you very well, and until now had no concern that you might catch on to me. You relic from a long-forgotten age." "Mr. Doyle, I presume," Holmes stated, raising his head as if to show the stranger that he was capable of fearlessly standing up to him. "If you wish, you may certainly call me that." He gave his consent. "Should I be afraid of you?" "Yes, that would be appropriate, though hardly helpful, as your heart will stop beating momentarily." He was already raising his handheld device to use it against Holmes. With a friendly smile, Holmes snapped the fingers of his free hand, whereupon Elmer appeared instantly, just as before. "Would you care for more tea, sir?" he inquired with exquisite politeness, without deigning to glance at the intruder. "No, Elmer, perhaps later. Rather, I require your striking power," Holmes instructed him. "Knock that peculiar weapon out of this malevolent man's hand." "He, he, he!" Doyle began to laugh wickedly and heartily. "He, he, he!" He could barely contain himself. "I'm sorry, sir, but a robot is strictly forbidden from committing acts of violence against humans." Elmer declined, though he allowed no regret to resonate in his voice. It was a factual statement which, due to his construction, he was incapable of feeling sorry about. "Really, Holmes, it's quite a shame about a laughing-stock like you," Doyle said with amusement. "I was observing you from my hiding place and nearly died laughing. I'll truly miss the naive, idiotic drivel you've been spouting in that pompous language of yours, your childish ignorance about our technology, and your affected mannerisms with those wooden gestures. Ha ha! You're as behind the times as a one-legged man trying to keep up with a pack of marathon runners." Holmes was rendered speechless by this enormous impertinence. Silent and rigid, he stared at his insolent visitor, the now empty teacup still in his right hand. "That's left you speechless, hasn't it? You costumed Neanderthal!" He jeered and laughed loudly. "Ha ha ha!" The events in the guest suite had not escaped the notice of the drone disguised as a fly, and it transmitted the images straight away via MMS to Decker. "Are you quite finished, or would you prefer to continue your vulgar insults?" Doyle's laughter stopped abruptly and his features darkened. Now, for the first time, things seemed to be getting tight for the famous English detective. Doyle put on a murderous expression, slowly approached, and could not believe that his next victim made no attempt whatsoever to escape. "Don't you even want to try to save yourself from impending death, Holmes?" He apparently relished the fear or surprise on his victims' faces and took pleasure in savouring it, and seemed rather annoyed that Holmes wouldn't grant him this satisfaction. "The encounter with death is exceedingly painful, Holmes." But he showed no fear to his adversary, didn't even bat an eyelid, and instead turned directly to his armchair. "Chair, the man wants to sit." Doyle was baffled for a split second. Immediately, the armchair drove towards Doyle, who hadn't grasped the command, and pinned him against the table. At the same time, Holmes hurled the empty teacup at his head with precise aim, causing Doyle to howl in pain and drop his device. "Ouch!" He tenderly felt his forehead where the teacup had hit him. "Unbreakable!" Holmes called out before making a hasty retreat towards the opening door, just to be on the safe side. At that moment of being helplessly wedged between the table and chair, the man in the flesh-coloured bodysuit looked quite comical, but Holmes didn't laugh. Instead, he ran as fast as he could out of his luxurious guest suite. Not out of cowardice, he simply had no desire whatsoever to continue conversing with this uncouth lout. Moreover, it seemed prudent to beat a retreat, as he knew too little about the technology of this completely foreign era. And he really didn't want to be among those dead heroes whose obituaries might honour them, but whose lives were cut rather short. The fly left its spot on the wall and dutifully followed Holmes. "Back, damn chair!" Doyle shouted, whereupon the chair retreated and released him. The sudden jolt, however, caused him to fall from the seat and land on his backside. Seething with rage, he quickly scrambled back to his feet. "Rah! You'll pay for this!" he bellowed. Elmer picked up the cup and politely inquired, May I offer you a cup of tea as well, sir? Get lost, you useless heap of metal! Doyle snarled furiously, picked up his device, and sprinted off in pursuit of Holmes. He ran at top speed towards the bridge, where he intended to seek help from his hosts. Unfortunately, he had left his pistol at home, as he had originally only planned to spend a private New Year's Eve with his best friend, the respected Dr. Watson. Annoyed at this oversight, he was already contemplating how to react should he encounter this lout again, if he failed to receive assistance from his hosts. Decker received the MMS pictures sent by the Fly in the private sector, where he and his deputy still couldn't find any trace of the alleged murderer Doyle, even though he and Tornot had even checked the cladding of the cable and air ducts. "Quick, Tornot! Our guest is in grave danger!" he cried out in horror and sprinted away. Let's hope he knows how to defend himself, though in his England things were rough enough too, with proper British manners often falling by the wayside. "Oh, stop being so pompous, man. Just get a move on." "Right away, sir." Both sprinted as fast as they could to the lift to reach the middle deck, where both the guest suite and the bridge were located. Holmes ran the distance between his suite and the bridge in a truly Olympic-worthy final sprint, arriving somewhat out of breath at his destination, and looked around. Just before the bridge door closed behind him and the Fly that had followed him, he saw Doyle hurrying towards him. "Lock the door," Holmes ordered, hoping that the door would stay shut when Doyle approached it. He was already looking around the bridge to see if he could use anything there as a weapon. However, everything he saw was either permanently installed or beyond his reach. Outside, he heard Doyle shouting, "Open the door!" "Lock the door!" shouted Holmes. "Open the door!" Doyle bellowed again. "Shut the door!" Holmes roared. "Door open!" "Shut the door!" "Open the door!" "Close 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 the door!" Both possessed remarkable persistence. "Open the door!" "Shut the door!" "Open the door!" "Shut the door!" These contradictory commands in rapid succession put the machinery in an unfamiliar predicament. The door had already opened 2 centimetres at Doyle's shout, then immediately closed again at Holmes's command. The process had repeated dozens of times, and now a siren began to wail, a consequence of the overtaxed machinery. Thus, an atonal sequence of discordant sounds rang out, which most grievously offended Holmes's ears. Accustomed only to the harmony of classical music, which he himself was capable of producing from time to time in contemplative moments with his violin, causing him to cover them with both hands, though traces of this diabolical music still managed to penetrate his ear canals. "That's even worse than a lovesick cat wailing outside my bedroom window at night," he complained with a groan. The alarm unfortunately also resulted in the failure of all lifts, which led to Decker and Tornot being stuck in one of them. "That's all we needed," Decker exclaimed. "Holmes has thrown the electronics into disarray." "I'm switching to manual operation, sir," Tornot announced, touching the touchpad on the side of the lift, which caused a small door next to it to pop open, revealing a simple hand crank behind it. "Old, but effective," Decker exclaimed cheerfully, operating it with vigour, whereupon the lift started moving again. "Just like our dear Mr. Holmes," said Tornot with a brief grin. "Indestructible!" Meanwhile, Doyle had also reached his limits at the locked bridge door, for although he kicked it in fury and hammered at it with his free left hand clenched into a fist, it remained firmly sealed, like an impregnable fortress that he lacked the ability to scale. "Bloody door! Open up!" he shouted, but it was of no use. The door to the bridge refused any sort of compliance, and remained sealed like an oyster harbouring a particularly precious pearl. As Decker finally emerged from the lift with Tornot, Doyle was still standing in front of the closed bridge door in his nude-coloured suit. He turned towards them, his face red with anger, threatened them with his device, but then decided to flee, quickly heading towards the side corridor. "After him!" called Decker, already running ahead of his second officer. But when he turned the corner into the side corridor, he could no longer see Doyle. "He's vanished!" "As if he'd made himself invisible!" Tornot noted perplexedly, whilst looking around searchingly and glancing up at the ceiling, without spotting even the slightest trace of the fugitive. "Hopeless! Let's go to Holmes!" Decker rushed to the bridge door and operated a touchpad on its left side, entering a code which silenced the tormenting siren sounds and caused the door to open willingly. "Welcome, First Officer Decker," greeted the ship's computer. "Holmes, did he hurt you?" "How glad I am to see you, Decker." Holmes was visibly relieved. "I was beginning to worry about my physical safety when faced with this utterly amoral, voyeuristic and subversive individual." "Like a bad penny, I always turn up," Tornot cheerfully declared as he entered, which once again earned him a stern look from his superior. "Gentlemen, this scum in his ridiculous flesh-coloured onesie had the audacity to insult me in the most dreadful manner. Apparently, besides lacking proper upbringing, he's devoid of any sense of hospitality. I doubt he has ever grasped the meaning of civilization." "At least he let you live?" Decker reassured him thoughtfully, whilst reckoning that Holmes must have been underestimated. "Only thanks to my quick wit and accuracy in throwing unbreakable porcelain am I still among the living. By the way, I would have a suggestion for improving your robots." He then made a dramatic pause, during which he looked from one person to another. "And what would that be?" Decker probed. "Elmer should indeed be allowed to attack a person who intends to harm or even kill another." "That simply won't do, Mr. Holmes," Tornot declined, shaking his head. "Back then, servants weren't allowed to interfere in their master's physical altercations either." "Oh yes," Holmes protested immediately. "I recall a case where Lady Althorpe's butler, James was his name, rushed to her aid and successfully protected her from the unwanted advances of an amorous assailant. And I remember a case where a butler, I'm afraid I can't recall his name, was the murderer." Decker responded spontaneously. "Well," Holmes fell silent and shrugged his shoulders, quite contrary to his usual manner. The fly now flew to Tornot and circled around him, as its mission to watch over Holmes during his solitude had evidently come to an end. "Oh, it appears one of your food cultivation insects has escaped." "Not to worry, it's just a drone," Decker reassured. "Oh, a male bee? Land that drone," ordered Tornot. "And it even obeys commands to the letter. Remarkable," Holmes observed as it landed on Tornot's outstretched palm. "I would have taken it for a common housefly, but around here it seems nothing is quite as simple as it appears." "Correct. It's a mechanical device called a drone that takes the form of a common housefly. Drone, show us your camera." On his palm, Tornot had the fly display its electronic innards. Holmes pulled his magnifying glass from the inner left pocket of his jacket and observed carefully how the fly, this small marvel of technology, opened its tiny wings and extended a minuscule camera. "I am, to use your contemporary parlance, absolutely gobsmacked. That's how we could see you were in danger and rushed to help," explained Decker. "So this devious adjutant managed to lurk around here unnoticed for a while. But why?" "To follow his evil impulse and execute something utterly sinister." Holmes offered a possible explanation whilst pocketing his magnifying glass. "Throughout all ages there have been villainous scoundrels who had nothing else in mind but to fight against good and possibly seize control." "Control over what?" asked Tornot, as he slipped the drone into his uniform jacket pocket. Holmes was just about to open his mouth to answer, but the first officer beat him to it. "Obviously control over this ship," Decker explained to him. "The only question is, what does he plan to do with it then?" "Well, I would say to travel through time just like you." With a somewhat vain gesture, Holmes ran his fingers through his hair. "Who knows? Perhaps he doesn't like his own era and wishes to return to ancient Egypt or ancient Rome." "Really?" Tornot ventured to ask, wondering if Holmes had been joking. "Oh yes, the devil never sleeps," Holmes declared, "and that's without any of your wake-up atamin." "What a scoundrel!" Tornot fumed. "Time to arm ourselves," Decker called out resolutely. "Ah, what weapons do they use in the future? Still swords, sabres, cannons, or pistols? Holmes had no idea about the destructive power of the new generation of weapons. On board, we only use neutron bracelets, as they exclusively destroy living human cells while sparing inorganic materials like glass and metal, which prevents damage to the ship, Tornot explained to him. And only in emergencies are the weapons distributed to officers like the two of us. They have a range of 50 meters. Computer! Neutron issue! At this command, he retrieved 2 handy black bracelets from a wall panel that had opened. He slipped one onto his own wrist and handed the other to his deputy. Tornot slipped his right hand into the neutron bracelet and showed Holmes the mechanism. With your palm turned downward and bent, you can reach and press the trigger at the lower end of the bracelet with your middle finger, whereupon the neutron beam immediately shoots out from the upper end and fatally strikes the villain, or seriously wounds them, depending on where you aim. But this isn't the same weapon that our murderer was carrying. Of course not, Holmes, Tornot confirmed. Only those with proper authorization can access this arsenal. That wretched traitor to human morality must have built his weapon himself. Well, humanity is quite ingenious when it comes to developing new weapons, observed Holmes, who was very well acquainted with human nature, its seemingly limitless possibilities and its darkest depths. Stay behind me at all times, Mr. Holmes. We're not permitted to hand over weapons to civilians. I understand that, of course, Mr. Tornot. I'll know how to defend myself when push comes to shove. Decker paced back and forth with his fingers clasped behind his back. Just imagine the havoc that fellow could wreak in an earlier time. If he violates the so-called causality boundary, he might even manage to prevent us all from being born and simply make us disappear. Of course we shall know how to prevent that, declared Holmes, with all the self-assured optimism of firm conviction. You fought very bravely against him, praised the second officer with an appreciative look. And all that without my firearm. He had something similar on him, which he didn't use straight away, presumably because he wanted to revel in my mortal fear first. But as you can imagine, gentlemen, I certainly wasn't going to give that scoundrel the satisfaction. Bravo! Tornot praised him once again. We must track him down and neutralize him. Decker recognized the necessity for immediate action. Computer, locate Adjutant Doyle's position. Adjutant Doyle is dead, the computer insisted. He was pulverized in the particle accelerator. Unfortunately, the footage is unavailable, as it was deleted by an unknown person. Who's speaking invisibly here? Asked Holmes, looking around searchingly. That's a magnificent machine with artificial intelligence. We call it the ship's computer, Tornot added to his superior's sentence. A helpful machine that has stored all of humanity's knowledge within itself. Well, if this machine claims Doyle is dead, even though we've all seen him, it can't be that intelligent or helpful, Holmes deduced mercilessly. Or perhaps Doyle has an evil twin brother? A clone. The scales fell from Tornot's eyes as he slapped his forehead. Then Doyle really is dead, and his clone has assumed his identity, or rather, is trying to establish his own identity. What on earth is a clone? Holmes couldn't possibly have known about that, as the famous cloned sheep named Dolly wasn't born until 5th of July 1996. That, my dear Holmes, is an artificially created twin of a person who nevertheless has their own identity, despite being the exact copy of their original, explained Decker, running a hand across his face. It's more complicated than we can explain to you in the time we have. In any case, this clone shouldn't be on board at all. Or at least behave in a civilized manner, Holmes criticised, wrinkling his prominent nose. He seemed to dislike these uncouth fellows who populated the world, or perhaps secretly envied their unconventional ways that brought them such enjoyment. But now I understand why he didn't respond appropriately when I addressed him as Doyle. That's why the clone mentioned that his kind didn't have names. That's correct, Tornot interjected. In our world, clones indeed don't have names, only serial numbers. Then I suggest we simply call him Nobody, or due to his attire, Pinky. Ha ha! Tornot laughed cheerfully. Nice designations, Mr. Holmes, but we need his serial number. Decker paced back and forth nervously. Computer, determine how many Doyle clones exist and print me a list of their serial numbers and whereabouts. May I be so bold as to ask why this number is so terribly important? Holmes couldn't understand why the hunt for the clone couldn't begin straight away, and why they had to first research its number, especially from an invisible machine. We have a special device that makes it easy to catch him, but for that, we need to know his serial number without a doubt, so that the so-called prison ring can actually grab him, Decker explained to him. Besides, we also need the number for our final report on this unpleasant matter, which we have to write and submit to our government. Sir, we are still rather far from achieving that, his deputy reminded him, pulling down the corners of his mouth. Well, I think we've made quite considerable progress. The rest of the case isn't nearly as mysterious anymore. Holmes appeared rather confident. The computer printed out the requested list, which Decker immediately examined. So, how many Doyle clones has the world been blessed with? Inquired Tornot, whilst peering over his superior's shoulder, having to stand on tiptoes to do so. With exactly 616, seems to be something of a successful model. Would you mind explaining to me why people are being copied in the future, and in such large numbers at that? This approach seemed inappropriate to Holmes and, given the possibility of bringing people into the world in the traditional way, rather unnecessary. Because in the future, they want to take fewer risks regarding the human factor, Decker explained. If you know that a person has desired qualities like diligence, high intelligence, endurance, patience, resilience, and so forth, then you're on the safe side if you replicate them. After all, even in the future, you still can't be quite sure what you'll get through natural means. Yes, the potential for disappointment is simply too great, Tornot confirmed. It's just that this clone on board apparently contradicts this knowledge, Holmes realised without malice. For it's unlikely that the selected original was a criminal. He's right, Tornot realised. This seems to be the first case where a clone proves unworthy of their original. We must first get hold of him in order to find out. Attention! Daflon calling Decker, interrupted the scientific director Daflon, whose face appeared on one of the large monitors, cutting off Decker's sentence. Oh, a talking head in a picture frame, Holmes observed, pointing at the monitor which reminded him of the screen in the guest suite where he had wished to see the constable painting. What is it? Decker asked curtly, turning his attention to the interruption. The captain's election. Daflon's face lit up as he announced it. According to regulations, I'm informing you before we begin. Ah yes, Dr. Z already mentioned something about that. And who has signed up for it so far? Many foes, much glory, my dear chap, Daflon teased him. Our lovely Rolka, our esteemed Brunswick, our honourable Ralbo, and then... Yees! Decker could hardly wait to find out who was the fourth member of his ambitious challengers, though he already had a dreadful feeling about it. Yours truly, announced Daflon, grinning from ear to ear. As scientific director, I don't see any conflict of interest whatsoever if I were to be elected captain. Oof! I didn't see that coming, Tornot blurted out, seemingly less than thrilled by the emerging prospect of having the scientific director as his boss. And he definitely saw a conflict of interest, since the scientist prioritised research and new discoveries, whilst the captain should primarily be concerned with the crew and their safety. Sherlock Holmes remained discreetly silent, as he had no intention of taking sides in the emerging duel between the various candidates for the leadership position aboard. He didn't even grant himself that right. His thoughts were still with the murdered victims and the brazen clone who had successfully managed to escape, now hiding somewhere in the vast ship, lying in wait for his opportunity. Hurry up if you want to participate too, Decker, Daflon urged him. You still have a good 15 minutes to think up a speech and present it calmly to the election committee. He emphasised the word calmly, even though he must have known exactly what enormous pressure Decker was under at that moment. but I'm currently in the middle of hunting down the murderer of Captain Beauregard and 4 other important crew members," Decker pointed out. The image on Daflon's monitor changed from a portrait to a full-body shot of the scientific director, who stood there very relaxed, as if he had already won over most of the voters. "Elections for the new captain of Ultimo 1, or success in hunting down a criminal. Make your choice, Decker." Daflon challenged him with a malicious grin, putting his hands in the pockets of his white coat to indicate his complete inaction regarding postponing the elections to a later date. After all, he wanted to win himself, and would not give his opponent the opportunity to outmaneuver him. Tornot gave his superior an encouraging nod. "Go ahead with the election, sir. Holmes and I can manage without you." "Really?" "Yes," confirmed Holmes, as always sure of himself. "We can manage this together with our combined efforts. And if I had to choose between the 2 options of a captain's election or an exciting, albeit probably exhausting criminal pursuit, I would absolutely prefer hunting down a ruthless murderer." "We're expecting you in the conference room," said Daflon. "Or would you like to decline?" The last sentence carried the hope that he would indeed do so, thereby increasing his own chances of being elected. "That option is still open to you, of course." "Thank you for your kind reminder, Daflon. I'll be right there. Over." Irritated, Decker switched off the monitor. "That's all I needed right now. I'm completely unprepared and I'm not exactly the best when it comes to giving speeches." "Well, my friend," Holmes began, patting him on the shoulder, "don't hide your light under a bushel. Bringing me aboard, even though it was quite a journey, will certainly prove advantageous for you, especially since I have already managed to identify the murderer. Apprehending him should also be a solvable task for me, supported by the capable second officer." When he heard the word capable, Tornot immediately grew 2 centimetres taller, which was due to him straightening his spine and proudly raising his head. "Right, then I'll rely on both of you and hurry to the elections, which are naturally very important to me. My future career for the next 100 years depends on making an excellent impression before the election committee. Hopefully, I'll have a brainwave on my way there about how to win the crew over to my side," Decker announced as he was leaving, thinking to himself, "It's a shame I don't have Holmes's eloquence." Hardly had he left when Tornot rustled very busily with the computer printouts, which caught the detective's attention. "Look here, Mr. Holmes. This shows all 616 Doyle clones with their serial numbers and current locations. It's likely that our man appears in here with a false location. Interesting, but how do we now determine whether the location details are correct or false?" Holmes posed the legitimate question whilst peering at the paper. "It's simpler than one might think," Tornot explained. "Look here at the first one with number 276234, and his location is listed as Terra 5 Sydney. That means he's on Earth, in the 5th continent, that is, Australia, in the city of Sydney. I understand. Terra stands for Earth, how unusual. For example, if it said Terra 6, that would be our man, since there is no 6th continent. For example, if it said Terra 6, that would be our man, since there is no 6th continent. After all, the Arctic and Antarctic are uninhabited. Or if there was the name of a wrong city, then that would be our man too." "Very good. Here are your lists to search through." Tornot had already begun feverishly, running his finger down the listed locations, which went quite quickly as he was already familiar with such work. "Oh, some joker must have been at work here," Holmes interrupted his concentration. "This actually says Mars to Elysium, and right after that Mars to Arcadia. All the ones on my list are supposedly on Mars." Holmes handed him the computer printout, shaking his head. "Yes, that might come as a bit of a shock to you, dear Holmes, but we colonised Mars over 20 years ago. Better give me that list with the Mars locations. I'm familiar with those, and you can search through the Earth locations." Somewhat bewildered, Holmes exchanged the lists with Tornot, and they both spent a short while scanning through the hundreds of locations with their corresponding numbers. "Aha!" exclaimed Holmes, raising his right hand with his index finger extended. I believe I've found him. It says here, terra tu parsi. That's either a typing error, in which case it would mean Paris in Europe, or it must be our murderer. Tornot quickly took Holmes's list and scrutinised it. That's him. For the computer doesn't make typing errors, so his serial number is 385769. And what steps will you take now to apprehend him? Something quite ingenious that you don't know about yet, Mr. Holmes. Let me show you our crowning glory, the so-called prison ring. From an elongated console, Tornot removed an iron ring that was 3 centimetres wide and had a circumference of 1 metre. In half a century, such a hoop will come into fashion and be sold as a popular toy, the so-called hula hoop, which one can rotate around the hips to stay fit and slim. And over 400 years before Christ, the so-called hoop rolling was already recommended, specifically in the Corpus Hippocraticum, in the treatise on lifestyle. You see, my dear friend, everything has happened before. Holmes looked at him rather condescendingly, as he always liked to show off his extensive general knowledge. Indeed, my dear Holmes, but now observe how I enter the serial number of our perpetrator, 3, 8, and 5, 7, 6, 9, into this small number pad on what we call the prison ring. He typed in the digits precisely, and watch how it independently carries out the search for our culprit. Barely had Tornot typed in the last digit when the prison ring began to hum loudly and slowly started rolling vertically towards the door. But how can it find the murderer based on the number? Inquired the astonished Holmes. That's the next shock for you. At birth, every person and every clone has a so-called chip implanted in their head, only 5 millimeters in size, which contains everything important. This includes the serial number for clones, or the name and date of birth of an original, and so forth. Dreadful and eerie to have something in your head that nature never intended to be there, but also eerily convenient when someone breaks society's rules, said Tornot. Come along, let's calmly follow the ring that will lead us to our criminal clone. The door to the bridge opened and the ring rolled ahead of them through the side passage, which led away from the bridge and through which Doyle's clone had disappeared moments ago. While the two hastily planned to continue searching the entire ship, Decker, meanwhile, arrived at the conference room on the upper deck, where the election committee, consisting of 30 crew members of the Ultimo 1, including Dr. Z, and his formidable opponents, were already seated. You're right on time, Daflon said cheerfully. Since you've already taken the captain's position on an interim basis, you also have the right to give the opening speech to try and win most of us over to your side. Thank you, said Decker, positioning himself in the centre of the hall and beginning an improvised speech with minimal gestures. Esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I wish it weren't necessary to elect a new captain, and that Beauregard, whom I admired as a superior and as my personal role model, were still among us. After he and 4 other valuable members of our crew met their unexpected deaths, I took it upon myself to solve this mystery and bring the murderer to justice. With the help of a professional detective named Sherlock Holmes, I was able to track down the perpetrator, a clone of Adjutant Doyle, who will soon be apprehended. Now he paused and wanted to consider his next words, but unexpectedly received applause from those present. Thank you, dear friends. You are surely wondering what will happen next, and what plans I have should I be elected captain. In that case, I intend to command the ship in accordance with regulations, and always maintain an open door for any concerns from its crew. Furthermore, with your help, I shall carry out all subsequent orders from the world government to ensure the safety of humanity on Earth and in the extraterrestrial colonies, without seeking personal glory. I could continue speaking, but I am more a man of action. I thank you for your attention and your contributions thus far, and I count on your votes so that I may prove my worth here aboard and to humanity. More applause. Dr. Z winked at Decker with a nod, as if indicating that he already had his vote. A glance at Daflon, who currently displayed a pinched expression, showed Decker the broad impact of his speech, and he calculated his chances of success as quite good. The next speaker to rise was Rolka, who took Decker's place, whilst he sat down at the large conference table and, like everyone else, listened to her subsequent words. Meanwhile, Holmes and Tornot had already searched most of the ship without finding any trace of the fugitive clone. The prison ring rolled relentlessly through long corridors and occasionally stopped, like a tracking dog, before deciding to roll on. Suddenly, a tremendous noise erupted that rang in Holmes's ears like the trumpets of Jericho. That is to say, how he had imagined the trumpets of Jericho would have sounded when, as a child, he had heard the Bible story about the walls of Jericho being brought down by those trumpets. A siren announced danger with loud wailing, which Holmes correctly interpreted, yet nevertheless maintained his composure, which, according to the saying, was known to be the first duty of a citizen. "Attention! This is not a drill!" blared the computer voice even louder than the sirens, throwing everyone into a state of high agitation, except for Holmes, who just stared ahead with a distinguished air. "Break out of the Terronians! Break out of the Terronians!" "What are Terrans?" he asked understandably, looking at Tornot, who had put on an alarmed expression. "Those are, exotic animals from another planet. They look terrifying, similar to black reptiles, and during their fits of rage, they develop many white spots on their skin," he explained, and the gravity of the situation was clearly evident in his manner. "Then they almost look like a Dalmatian. Oh, I suppose you wouldn't know about those dogs." A reproachful glance was cast his way. "Indeed, I do know what a Dalmatian is," Holmes protested at once. "In England, during the Victorian era, it was very popular as a carriage dog. Yes, now I remember. Depictions of Dalmatian-like dogs were found in ancient Egyptian pharaohs' tombs," he exclaimed. "Speaking of dogs, that reminds me of the remarkable case of the Hound of the Baskervilles." "Please don't tell me that story now." "Well, this hound was rather dangerous, just like your terriers. Except that our Terrans are 6'3" and run quite fast on their two legs. But I suppose they are mortal like all other creatures?" Holmes reassured himself. "That's right, and with the neutron beam, I can easily take them out once we've located them." He swung his right wrist triumphantly where he wore the bracelet. "If, contrary to expectations, one of them should prove resistant and survive, what would we have to fear?" Holmes wanted to know, already anticipating the answer. "The attack of such a creature combined with a very painful bite. As far as I know, such a bite would result in paralysis, like the bite of a venomous snake." The prison ring continued to roll, but Tornot no longer paid it any attention. And Holmes immediately understood that capturing these exotic Terrans had to be the top priority. "We can assume that our malevolent clone released them to divert attention from himself," concluded Tornot. "What an utter scoundrel!" "Then it's also reasonable to assume that he killed their guards," Holmes surmised. There aren't any guards. The Terrans were securely locked up in the cargo hold. In that case, we should get ourselves over there straight away. They might still be lurking about waiting for an easy target." "That's a good idea, Holmes." Tornot praised him and hurried with him to the nearest lift to go down. Unease spread through the conference room. Brunswick had just finished his rather clumsy speech, which had managed to inspire only a few, as several listeners had yawned when the alarm jolted everyone from their seats. And the announcement explaining its cause did little to calm nerves, instead leading to agitated murmuring amongst all those present. "Decker, what is the meaning of this? Who is responsible for the escape of these dangerous species?" Daflon was immediately outraged, as he seemed to relish the opportunity to discredit Decker. "Make sure these monsters return to their cages at once, or you'll lose the election, and, if things go really badly, your life as well. I don't need your orders. I know perfectly well what I need to do, and I'm already carrying a weapon." With great confidence, he raised his right wrist and showed everyone his bracelet. "Then of course you'll stay here and protect us," Ralbo now demanded of him. "And who's supposed to catch these beasts then?" Rolka wanted to know. always the one who asks," retorted Melwyn. "You're the perfect one to expose yourself to such danger. I'm quite certain you won't even need a weapon for it." "Exactly," Daflon joined in. "I suggest Rolka hurries to her combat robots to neutralize those rebellious animals." "Indeed," Brunswick agreed immediately. "I also vote that you defend us in case of emergency, Decker." Decker and Rolka looked at each other before the petite Talita chimed in. "I reckon we'll be safe here in the hall if we simply lock ourselves in and hold out until both Rolka and Decker have dealt with the danger." A brief silence before both Decker and Rolka rushed to the door and stepped out, as if responding to an inaudible command. Decker turned around and said, "Talita's idea is good. Nothing can happen to you here. Trust us. Computer, lock the door." The door closed and was immediately locked electronically. "Entry now only possible with direct code input," announced the computer voice sternly. Then they made their way to the lift to head down to the combat robots on the middle deck. In the cargo hold of the Ultimo 1, Holmes found only the empty, open cages of the escaped Terrans. "How many animals are we talking about?" "Well then, Mr. Holmes." "Don't tell me you don't know." "Actually, no." "Can one determine that?" Tornot silently berated himself for not having asked the computer about it yet, so he hurried to one of the touchpads next to the lift and frantically asked, "Computer, how many Terrans are on board?" "6. "Can we not determine their whereabouts?" asked Holmes. "No, because they aren't chipped, which means they don't have a chip in their head." "And this clone has had such a chip in its head since birth, or have I misunderstood that?" "That's true, but he's not officially registered on board," Tornot explained, slightly dejected. "The computer can only determine the location of officially registered chip carriers. Unfortunately, it's a complicated administrative matter. Anyone who hasn't been entered into the computer simply doesn't exist to it." "I believe I understand. It's like a missing entry in the church's birth register," Holmes realised. Meanwhile, Rolka experienced a nasty surprise when she reached her combat robots. All of their heads had been unscrewed and were lying carelessly next to their respective steel bodies. "Who did this? Which idiot ruined my robos?" she screamed hysterically, jerking her head so that her red plaits wobbled. "Well, that's obvious." "What? Do you mean those wretched Terrans, Decker?" "No, our clone. Control yourself, Rolka. If you're aspiring to a leadership position, you ought to get a grip on your temper," Decker advised her. "I'm simply a very passionate, hot-blooded woman, and these combat robots are practically my babies." "At least he didn't completely destroy them, just caused minor damage." "Yes, because he can easily reprogram them and make them work for his purposes," said Rolka, who had put on a sympathetic expression. "I'm convinced you'll manage the repairs in record time," he said, and left her standing there. "Where are you going now?" "Down to the cargo hold. With any luck, the escaped Terrans are still there. Put the combat robots back together and make sure that Clone doesn't stab you in the back." "Don't worry, I've got a reliable motion detector in my belt. It'll warn me if anyone tries to sneak up on me from behind." She immediately set about reattaching and screwing the heads back onto her beloved robots. Decker took the E-lift down to the cargo bay where he met Tornot and Holmes. "Heaven has sent you, sir," Tornot rejoiced. "We can use all the help we can get to recapture those 6 Terrans." "I already have a strong suspicion where they might have taken shelter," said Decker confidently. "And where would that be?" "Well, that's obvious, my dear Tornot," said Holmes whilst rubbing his belly. "Where they can find food." "Of course," the second officer exclaimed as the penny dropped. "Now we just need to know what these creatures actually eat," Holmes pondered, looking at Decker. "Insects." "Well, then we all know where to find them." Holmes rejoiced, vividly remembering his shocking encounter with the crawling creatures that were popular here as a source of food and protein. As quickly as they could, they hurried to the darkest corner of the lower deck, where they indeed found the Terrans. One of the terrifying creatures had smashed a glass pane and was feasting on a handful of living locusts, which it greedily stuffed into its maw, including their little legs that loudly crackled as it bit down and crunched away. The other Terrans were already sitting in a corner with rather full, slightly bloated bellies, and seemed to be having a little digestive nap whilst huddled together. They weren't disturbed in the slightest by the noise of the siren. Perhaps they could also seal their ear openings soundproof. The good news was that they all showed only a few white spots on their black skin, which revealed they weren't particularly in an aggressive mood. However, that could change quickly. "We'll let them live," Decker decided promptly. "Computer, seal off the insect farm." As per the command, a steel wall slid down, behind which the Terrans and their remaining live meal vanished from Decker, Holmes, and Tornot's field of vision. "Why did you capture these strange, exotic creatures in the first place, Mr. Decker? For the zoo?" Holmes inquired out of curiosity. "No, for research purposes. They have a special resistance against diseases, germs, and bacteria. New medicines are to be manufactured from their blood." "That makes sense," acknowledged Holmes. "Now, we just need to find that obstinate clone, then victory will be ours." Tornot rubbed his hands together, already relishing the thrill of the hunt. "I'm afraid I have bad news, my friend," Holmes interjected. "And what would that be? Did you not keep count earlier of how many Terrans were just locked up?" No, I'd assumed 6, said Tornot uncertainly, annoyed with himself for having forgotten to count at that crucial moment. "I'm afraid there were only 5, Holmes revealed, without sounding condescending. "Don't worry about it. Precise observations happen to be my speciality. Look on the bright side. You now only need to catch one more of these exotic specimens." "Well, that's certainly a relief," Tornot lied. "Where could it possibly have hidden? We know too little about these creatures. They're practically unstudied, so it satisfied its hunger and He looked first at Decker and then at Holmes, seeking help. "Are these animals all males or all females, or have you caught a family?" he probed. "To be honest, I don't know. Do you know, sir?" he said, looking at his superior. Decker shook his head. "They certainly bear a resemblance to our known reptiles. That much is certain." "Well, then, the missing Tyrone is presumably searching for a mate-ready female if it's a male Tyrone, or for a male if it's a female Tyrone. Self-preservation and preservation of the species. The age-old game of life," Holmes philosophized. Now we just need to know where it's looking for a mate?" Decker asked, more to himself. "I might be wrong, but I believe he's trying his luck in your private sector. There's a relaxed atmosphere up there, and he might have caught the scent of it, or perceived it in some other way." "Holmes, you're a genius!" Tornot buttered him up. "Come on, we need to get upstairs as quickly as possible." "Yes, you go and search for him while I take care of returning the 5 prisoners to their cages," Decker ordered. They took the lift to the upper deck where the private sector was located. No sooner had they stepped out of the lift when they heard a loud, extremely shrill scream. "Aye! That is clearly the scream of a lady in distress," Holmes observed, and hurried with the second officer towards the source of the scream. "I hope he doesn't harm any of our women," Tornot muttered whilst running at full speed. They spotted the Terran by one of the food dispensers, where he held a very pretty, semi-conscious blonde lady in his clawed hands. "That's not Laura," Holmes noted quietly. "Even though she has the same hairstyle and skimpy uniform, even in moments of danger, he could always rely on his keen eye for detail. It's Selina he's caught, a colleague from the spare parts procurement department," Tornot whispered to him. The Tyrone had noticed their approach and quiet conversation, and turned towards them, holding Selina in front of him like a shield whilst using the food dispenser behind him as cover. A certain strategic mindset in his nature became apparent. Since he didn't want to put Selina in harm's way, Tornot dared not use his neutron bracelet. "We'll have to overpower this devious beast another way." "Let's split up," Holmes suggested. "You try from the right side and I'll go from the left." "Agreed." "Help!" shrieked Selina, who appeared to be unharmed but couldn't hide her fear and disgust with her shock-widened pupils. "Don't be afraid, Lady Selina," Holmes reassured her. "Shh," hissed the brute. as a small cloud of breath escaped from his reptilian nostrils. "I sincerely hope he can't breathe fire," said Holmes, whilst fishing his magnifying glass out of his jacket's inner pocket. The Tyrone was unsure whether to turn left or right as he saw the two brave men creeping towards him. As he turned towards the second officer, Holmes swung back and threw his magnifying glass at the back of his head, causing the struck Tyrone to yelp, or rather hiss, making a sound similar to a beaten dog's whimper. He reflexively released Selina, who let herself drop flat to the ground, allowing Tornot to incapacitate the enraged Tyrone with the neutron beam from his wristband. The reptile writhed in unprecedented agony before collapsing and perishing with a large wound in its chest. At once, Holmes bent over the blonde lady lying on the ground and gently lifted her up. "Are you all right, my poor dear?" "Oh, yes, I believe I'm unharmed." "Well, thank God," Holmes exclaimed as he let her go, whereupon she immediately arranged her blonde hair in a flirtatious gesture. It smelled of jasmine and showed golden highlights in individual strands. "Thank you so much. You're a true gentleman," she chirped, casting him an amorous glance. "I beg your pardon, any gentleman would have done the same, rushing to assist immediately when a lady requires his help." Yes, Mr. Holmes," said Tornot, "but let's not trouble God any more. The phrase 'thank God' is long outdated. Who knows? Perhaps he does exist and is looking down upon us with approval," said Holmes, pointing upwards. "I'll head back to my work then," Selina announced, looking at Holmes. "Perhaps we could meet up later if your schedule permits." "Nothing would make me happier, Lady Selina," he assured her, and in that moment he meant it with absolute sincerity. With a hint of desire in his gaze, he watched her until the lift doors closed behind her. "Well, now we must return our attention to hunting down our clone," Tornot reminded him reluctantly, as he too would have preferred the company of a lady. "Then we should return to Mr. Decker," Holmes suggested, "for the three of us are more likely to apprehend him, as a triumvirate, so to speak. So back into the lift then, so the hunt can finally continue. Oh, I wish it were already over." "I don't mean to appear pedantic, but let me give you one piece of advice, my friend. You should consciously savour every second of your life. Never wish for time to pass more quickly, for it always slips away in the blink of an eye." Meanwhile, Decker had made good use of his time and, with Elmer's help, had manoeuvred the 5 stuffed Terrans back into their cages and was already waiting downstairs for his 2 highly motivated comrades. "Where would you hide, Mr. Holmes, if you were the clone?" he asked. "Naturally, in a place where you'd least expect to find me," he announced, quick-witted and mysteriously. "Very clever," Tornot praised him instantly. "That would be—" Decker broke off and started running as if all the furies of hell were after him. "Where are you running to, sir?" inquired Tornot, chasing after him helter-skelter. "We shall find out straight away," declared Holmes, who brought up the rear as he joined the 2 men. They took the express lift that brought them back to the bridge. "You think he's on the bridge?" "Alarm off!" ordered Decker, whereupon the dreadful sound immediately fell silent. "No, I suspect he's somewhere else, though I'd rather not say where in case he can hear us." "Ah!" exclaimed Tornot as realization dawned. "I have an inkling where you suspect he is, so I suggest that Tornot holds position here, so he can intercept him should he dare venture onto the bridge." "Right then, Holmes, come with me." "I'll wait here for you, sir," Tornot assured him unnecessarily. It irked him that he couldn't figure out where clone 385769 had barricaded himself, and he pondered and pondered. Meanwhile, Holmes and Decker arrived at Beauregard's private quarters, where the prison ring was already waiting outside the door. "Open the door," Decker commanded in a harsh tone. At once, the door opened and the prison ring rolled through at high speed, enveloping an invisible something that promptly became visible. It was the clone in his nude-coloured bodysuit, with the ring hovering around his hips like a hula hoop. Evidently, the prison ring's electronics had neutralised the electronics of his camouflage clothing. "Your invisibility invention appears to be no match for the prison ring," Holmes noted with satisfaction. You made yourself quite comfortable here in the quarters of the captain you murdered, lying in wait for an opportune moment to seize control of the ship. But you're only a clone. You would have never succeeded, said Decker, threatening him with his wristband on his outstretched right arm. Throw me your weapon, or I'll injure you with the neutron beam. With a tortured expression, he threw a metal object to him, which Decker caught with his left hand. Do you have anything to say in your defence? Holmes now asked the captured clone. As long as you are being kept in check by the prison ring, that unwelcome piece of jewellery? Oh, what could this clone possibly have to say for himself, except that he acted out of pure malice? Decker remarked contemptuously. Yes, I'm just a clone, but I'll tell you something about your precious Captain Beauregard, that two-faced bandit. Silence! Decker snapped at him, giving the impression that he was about to become physical. Though he found it difficult to maintain his composure as a candidate for the captain's position, he forced himself to do so. With a sidelong glance, Holmes advised him, May I take the liberty of suggesting that you let him continue speaking? That way you'll learn the whole truth, even if it's unpleasant and disillusioning. Yes, very much so, the clone continued. Beauregard was anything but the honourable man he made himself out to be to all of you. Whether you believe me or not, he was a bandit who colluded with Forsk, Pomej, and their lot. I swear to you that he smuggled me aboard secretly so he could test his dangerous experiments on me without having to obtain permission from the High Command. I really don't believe you, Decker hissed with narrowed eyes. Why would he have done that? Inquired Holmes with raised eyebrows. Because then he wouldn't have had to be accountable in case of failure. You see, it always leaves a bitter taste when one conducts an experiment and it goes wrong. Very bad for one's career prospects. You can believe me on that. And the poor light falls on the accomplices as well. Those must have been all the other dead people? Holmes guessed, or rather he knew it, because it wouldn't have made any sense for the clone to simply eliminate someone from the crew who wasn't involved in this dubious matter at all. Yes, exactly. They all wanted to cover themselves in glory at my expense. The whole lot of these so-called honourable gentlemen. But I certainly put a spanner in their works, as you must admit, Mr. Holmes. And why would he even conduct experiments here on board? Asked Decker, bewildered, as this new revelation about his colleagues, and especially the sacrosanct Captain Beauregard, lay heavy in his stomach. Are you not listening to me? Because he was after fame and glory. He wanted admiration from all of you and a position in the government. It's as simple as that. But to you, he always played the role of the honourable captain. Must be awful for you to realise that you chose the wrong role model. Decker slumped a bit, barely able to comprehend that he had never noticed these alleged ulterior motives of his superior. That he could have so completely misjudged someone he had held in such high regard, even beyond death. Yes, fame and glory have always been the primary objectives of those in high positions, declared Holmes. History has shown this time and time again. Apparently, I'm not particularly bright when it comes to history, Decker admitted, somewhat deflated. Until now, I'd always assumed that power and money were the most important things for such historical figures. Think of the great pharaohs who wished to be godlike and proclaim the glory of their deeds on stone monuments such as the pyramids. Holmes, I'm absolutely gobsmacked by your knowledge, Decker blurted out rather casually. You are truly an exemplary man indeed. Thank you. But I can reveal one more thing to you, announced the clone with a grin that resembled a baring of teeth. And what would that be? Inquired Decker, already somewhat impatiently. His wristband computer announced itself with a beeping sound, prompting him to ask grumpily, Yes? Decker! Daflon's voice rang out. We're still trapped in the conference room. Have you had any success hunting down the Terrans? We want to be able to move about freely again. Yes, I was successful. And the criminal clone of Adjutant Doyle has been neutralised. I'll free you in 2 minutes, he promised. Get on with it. Then he turned his full attention back to the clone. So, what did you want to tell me? That none of you will ever enjoy life again. "Ha ha ha!" the clone screeched, took a small pill from the left sleeve of his suit and swallowed it, or rather, hastily choked it down, whereupon he seemingly collapsed dead. The prison ring fell to the ground with a soft clinking sound, as it had fulfilled its task of capturing someone alive. It no longer needed to guard a dead person. Holmes felt the clone's pulse. "He's dead. At least there's no detectable pulse. Nevertheless, I shall put handcuffs on him, which I happen to have with me." Holmes took a piece of string from his back trouser pocket, which he tied around the motionless clone's wrists. "It wouldn't surprise me if he possessed some technique that only allows him a very brief death." "Very clever, Mr. Holmes," Decker praised him. "But we can assume that he is indeed dead as a doornail, for the prison ring wouldn't miss it if the clone showed any sign of life, however faint it might be. I must now quickly head to the conference hall where I've locked up the election committee for their safety. Once everyone is free again, I'll return to you." "Yes, do go," encouraged Holmes, who wanted to solve the mystery of the clone's invisibility. "And good luck with your election." "Thank you." When Decker unlocked the door to the conference room 2 minutes later as promised, he caught the tail end of Brunswick's complaint. "The 2 minutes are up." "Oh, there he is," said Brunswick as the door opened, quickly putting on a smile. Then Decker experienced a surprise. Talita rushed towards him, hugged him warmly, and said with a friendly smile, "Congratulations, sir. In your absence, we've elected you almost unanimously as the new captain of the Ultimo One." One after another shook his hand in recognition, though Daflon visibly struggled somewhat with the gesture. "My dear Decker," he began, attempting something of an explanation. "During those anxious moments of danger, you demonstrated impressive nerve and decisiveness. We hardly had any choice but to elect you as our leader." "A compliment from your lips honours me twice over, Daflon. I would never have expected to hear such words from you, and it makes them carry so much more weight for me." "Yes, I'm certain we'll get along splendidly, particularly if, as scientific director, I continue to receive my resources for researching the Terrans and their blood, for the good of humanity." "And to enhance your reputation, eh?" Dr. Z interjected. "The Terrans are well fed," Decker remarked to Daflon before turning to Dr. Z. "Well done, Decker. You're a man after my own heart. And since you've also managed to solve the murder of your predecessor." To be honest, Mr. Holmes solved it. After all, Doyle's clone wasn't officially on board. How devious of him! But that's all in the past now, and we can look to the future with high spirits. "Oh, Captain Decker," trilled the enchanting lurer, "it will be an even greater pleasure for me from now on to bring you the authorization slips for time travel." "Thank you, lurer. It will be an equally great pleasure to receive them from your delicate hand." The promising way she looked at him revealed that he would have good chances with her. Everyone wanted to have a few words with the new captain, and so quite some time passed, which Holmes used in Beauregard's private quarters to examine the clone more closely. His suit consisted of a maze of wires and magnets on the inside. "How utterly fascinating," Holmes muttered. "It must be quite a tricky method to make oneself invisible with this wire contraption, though to file a patent, one would need precise sketches and several experiments of one's own." When Decker returned, Holmes had already been rummaging through Beauregard's desk drawers. I was able to determine that Beauregard was also interested in making himself invisible. From these scrawled notes on paper, I can deduce that it involves a force field which, combined with the wire mesh in the flesh-coloured suit that the clone presumably had to wear as a test subject, enables light to be directed around the body, rendering it invisible, although it naturally retains its shape, mass and weight. "Well, I never!" exclaimed Decker, who was rather astonished by the technical aptitude of a man from the early 20th century. To consider Sherlock Holmes a member of a primitive species, from the perspective of the 22nd century, would have been a mistake, as he increasingly proved himself to be a true master of logic. Entirely worthy of continuing his investigations in literary adventures well into the future, long after his physical death. I understand why he didn't want to wear this suit himself and chose a volunteer, or perhaps an unwilling participant for that purpose. Holmes concluded his observations. Yes, but why did he want to be invisible? After all, he could observe everything in detail through cameras. My dear Decker, the dream of being able to move invisibly amongst people is indeed a very old one, Holmes lectured him. Even in conversations with my good friend Dr. Watson, I have pondered aloud what it would be like if I could move about completely unseen, though I would naturally have to be careful not to get run over by a hansom cab. Perhaps he was also looking for a way to become invulnerable. I would never have thought him capable of that, said Decker, with disappointment about his superior clearly written across his face. And what about this weapon that the clone handed over to you? Decker pulled the metallic object from his uniform jacket pocket and showed it to Holmes. As far as I can tell, this is some sort of homemade jamming device, a simple cardiac rhythm disruptor. When you stand close enough to the victim, you can easily stop their heart without leaving any external signs of violence. How diabolical of the clone, remarked Holmes, before softening his stance. Then again, if you consider that he was abused as a guinea pig, one can easily understand his anger and thoughts of revenge, even if they are morally reprehensible. At that moment, Tornot joined them. Congratulations on your captaincy, sir, he said and saluted. I've just heard about it. I'm so pleased for you. Thank you, Tornot. I hereby officially appoint you as first officer. Thank you, sir. With this delightful promotion, he seemed to grow 5 centimetres taller. I'm pleased for myself. Oh, in that case, I'd like to add my congratulations, Mr. Decker. Pardon me, Captain Decker, you'll surely lead this proud ship from one success to another. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. It is a great honour for me to be allowed to take this spaceship forth to new worlds. Yeah, Tornot, the new first officer, agreed. Do better than your predecessor. That's the only advice I can give you, my friend from the future. Well, humans will always remain a mystery, said Decker, alluding to his misjudgment of his former superior. It would be far too boring otherwise, joked Tornot, the first officer, in a relaxed and cheerful manner. And you, Mr. Holmes, I presume you'll always fondly remember our memorable encounter? Certainly, Captain, and to assure you of my discretion, I won't tell anyone, as no one would believe me anyway. I can well understand that, said Tornot. Oh, how wonderful it must be to still be spared from all this complicated technology. I have nothing against technology, only against its misuse, Holmes clarified. But that's human nature, Decker observed. Everything that was invented for humanity's benefit can also be used to cause harm. Actually, many things were first used to cause harm before their benefits were even recognised. Holmes corrected him. Yes, yes, said Tornot. War is the father of all things. Let's talk about something more pleasant, Decker suggested. About something that could be of use to us? Asked Tornot. For example, replied the newly promoted captain, when I consider everything I've learnt here, even my countryman Thomas More wrote a treatise in 1516 about an island state called Utopia, but never in his life would he have dreamt that there would one day be clones, robots, spaceships, talking furniture, and the like. And that's only a fraction of what you've seen, Decker pointed out to him. What a shame there isn't enough time to show you more, Torno lamented. I suggest we pay you in gold, Mr. Holmes, a precious metal that has always maintained quite a high value, said Decker kindly, whilst giving him a well-meaning pat on the shoulder. Then you can buy a new house, hire more staff, and focus on new cases. And I suggest, Holmes began with an encouraging gesture, that we first travel further back into the past, to the Elizabethan era, to 1560 to be precise, so that I might solve the death of Lady Amy Robsart, wife of Lord Robert Dudley. You see, she died under circumstances that were never fully explained. But first, let us collect my friend, the good Dr. Watson. His eyes will surely pop out of his head. He clapped his hands as he spoke. Would you care for some more tea, Mr. Holmes? Elmer appeared and asked. Splendid, my friend. Bring a large tray with 3 cups. Then we shall all sit down comfortably and drink this wholesome tea whilst we travel back in time." Holmes rejoiced, rubbing his hands together in anticipation. "Chairs, we wish to sit." As 3 armchairs glided forward from the back of Beauregard's quarters, he immediately took a seat in one of them. Tournot was still considering whether he should sit down, and he looked questioningly and somewhat lost towards his superior. Captain Decker's face suddenly went numb. You are listening to Pomej, Sherlock Holmes in Space. Prequel to Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases. Based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A goaudio production